When it comes to telling the story of Top Gear's cast and crew, most of it, particularly after the early 2000s, is fairly clear-cut. Jeremy Clarkson was the face of Top Gear throughout the 1990s and the key cornerstone that guaranteed its success as the show rose, fell and then subsequently shot back up to superstardom that it achieved in the 2000s. James May was a welcome return from the old format, having previously presented in 1999 during a short-lived on-screen tenure after a pre-established history within automotive journalism as a playful character yet with an interesting nuanced second side to him. The Stig, an idea cooked up by Clarkson and Andy Willman, proved to be a marketing masterstroke. With the character's lack of a physical or vocal identity, it ironically became one of the show's most recognizable symbols. And other than Jason Dorr, who presented parts of the first 10 Top Gear episodes and who I've already covered in a video I made last year, Top Gear's on-screen lineup stayed remarkably consistent for 12 whole years, both at the forefront of the program as well as the crew behind it. And of its three main personalities, Richard Hammond was the only one of that so-called Holy Trinity to have never presented the show before 2002. Interestingly, however, as you'll find out during this introspective into the Hamster's life, he came very close to doing just that. And in the years that followed his eventual appointment to the program, Hammond would gradually mature and grow to define himself as a presenter and as a personality in his own right. And despite suffering a life-threatening crash in the vampire jet car a mere 4 years later, he embarked on a slow road to recovery that saw Richard Hammond reach new heights in his career. Though not the favourite host of many male fans of Top Gear due to his overly charismatic personality, the show's beloved Hamster was a vital part that helped to make the programme tick, as well as becoming a heartthrob for many girls born in the 1990s and early 2000s, as even my own sister can attest. But who gave Hamster his first wheels? How did he get into the position of achieving such a lucrative job as presenting Top Gear in the first place, and how did he cement his legacy as a global superstar and become one of the most influential on-screen personalities of the 21st century? Over the next 2 hours, we're going to learn how from especially humble beginnings, Richard Hammond made a name for himself in show business and established his very own long-lasting impact on the entertainment industry. If there's any mistakes and a certain short middle-aged bloke from Solihull would like to offer corrections, I would love it if he could watch this video and offer some form of commentary, as I aim to make this video as accurate and biographical as it can possibly be. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, there's a Ko-Fi and a Patreon link in the description so you can help out. In a way, Richard Hammond was destined to work in or around cars. His paternal grandfather, George Hammond, taught Polish airmen how to drive during World War II, whenever he wasn't busy defusing and helping to reverse-engineer German bombs, whereas his maternal grandfather, Leslie Albert Dunsby, had apprenticed as a cabinet maker and subsequently spent most of his life at coach-building firm Mulliners, where he would build the wooden frames which held the hand-built aluminium body panels of the cars they built together, before finishing up his career at Jensen Motor Cars as a senior inspector, right around the time they were building their famous Interceptor sports car. According to Hammond himself, there wasn't a single material that Dunsby didn't have some form of an expert's proficiency with, carving wood, turning metal, and working leather. Dunsby's wife, Kathleen Shaw, also had a deep connection within the British automotive industry and was employed at the Colmore Depot, which during its peak was the country's largest supplier of Morris and Morris commercial vehicles. After his parents settled down, Richard Mark Hammond would be born on the 19th of December 1969, as the eldest of 3 brothers to father Alan and mother Eileen Dunsby, in Solihull, a city situated at the heart of the British automotive industry and a stone's throw from Birmingham, the home of British Leyland. Hammond is the older brother to Nicholas and Andrew Hammond, the latter the author of the Crypt series of fictional young adult literature. Starting from the age of 6, Hammond would pay frequent visits to his grandfather Leslie's house, where he resided, along with Hammond's grandmother and great-grandmother, which clearly had a major impression on him. Even in retirement, Dunsby was a relentless, tireless handyman, having converted his house's attic into a workshop filled with tools and parts, where Leslie would repair and build anything you asked of him, from furniture such as sideboards and tables, all the way through to go-karts and pedal cars, the latter of which were frequently raced around the streets of 70s Solihull by a juvenile Hammond. In school, Hammond would have a rather troubled early childhood, given the nickname of Owl Eyes by his peers due to his eyes that were proportionally large for his age compared to the rest of his face, and was an early academic underachiever, one who was described rather disparagingly by his first headmaster at Sharman's Cross Junior School, a Mr. Dainty, as someone who would never amount to anything, a rather damning verdict that would always linger in Hammond's mind for the next 20 years of his life. In this photograph of a school play from the late 1970s taken by Peter Barton, whose daughter also attended the school at the same time, we can see Hammond quite prominently in the middle of this photograph, acting out his part in a play whose set his grandfather Leslie had built. But it was in 1978, more specifically in April of that year, when English stuntman Eddie Kidd famously jumped 14 buses with a motorcycle in front of a crowd of 30,000 people and a television audience of millions more, where Hammond truly considers his life to have started. Deeply inspired by Kidd and his American equivalent Evel Knievel, Hammond prepared to perform a stunt jump of his very own, over an Action Man doll, a toy helicopter, and a toy Jeep. With a torn strip from a box of Weetabix firmly lodged between the spokes of his Austrian-designed Putz's rear wheel, he was ready to roll in the closest thing a primary school boy could get to a bona fide Harley or Triumph. Needless to say, likely owing to the fact his initials weren't EK, the stunt wasn't successful, as the ramps he'd constructed were simply too flimsy to support the weight of his bicycle, resulting in Hammond's first ever faceplant. In the years that followed, Hammond would eventually upgrade to a 10-speed racing bike, and as he continued to mature and discover new things, learned how to completely disassemble and reassemble bicycles to the very last nut and bolt. By the time Hammond was 11, he would volunteer to rebuild his brother Andy's red Peugeot Racer, a process which took several weeks to complete. When the time came to giving the bike a once-over test ride to see if his repair job was up to scratch, Hammond would run over a patch of loose gravel which caused him to have the first major accident of his life, causing him to skin several of his fingers on his right hand along with a chunk of his right shoulder. Naturally, Hammond was undeterred from these early prangs and sought to move up to a motorbike, and eventually, for his 16th birthday in December 1985, his parents duly bought him his very first pair of wheels, a Honda MTX 50. The MTX 50 was used and fairly battered about, but that didn't matter to Hammond, for that was the first day of the rest of his life. On a shoestring budget, Hammond's first riding outfit was comprised of a £5 leather jacket he'd bought off a friend, along with a set of cheaply made off-road boots. He would soon replace the MTX 50 with a Honda XL100, which had twice the displacement, before replacing that with a Kawasaki GP100, which was written off after it was smashed into by an Austin Metro. However, as much as these early motoring experiences were for Hammond, they were ultimately stepping stones for what he really wanted the most, a car. For Hammond's 18th birthday in 1987, he would buy his very first car, a 1976 Toyota Corolla liftback, which he promptly decorated with a Jap crap sticker on the windscreen and a vague attempt at a Confederate flag on the roof similar to the General Lee in Dukes of Hazzard. However, as seems to be the pattern at this point for Top Gear hosts and their first cars, the Corolla would not last long before it was involved in a particularly nasty shunt after serving a brief tenure as a taxi for Hammond's friends, where the group pushed the Corolla's spunky 1600cc engine to its absolute limit. Hammond would have marginally better luck with his second car, a Jago Jeep, a World War II Willys replica built on the running gear of a Mark II Ford Escort. Though the Jeep was admittedly falling apart from the minute he bought it, it taught Hammond many valuable mechanical skills, including how to do a full gearbox replacement, which his father Alan assisted him with. At this point in time, Hammond was briefly in a rock band with his friends, with Hammond the bassist, and the Jeep would be used by his bandmates as transport. Throughout his teenage years, Hammond, along with the rest of his family, would move to the North Yorkshire city of Ripon, as it was near to the village of Fawns and Wattless, where his father Alan ran a probate business. Though initially attending the Blossomfield Infant School before graduating upwards to the Solihull School, his move north necessitated a transfer to Ripon Grammar School, and upon earning his O-levels, would attend the Harrogate College of Art and Technology from 1986 until 1988, during which time he worked at a camera shop, as photography was an early passion of his. Though never written down anywhere, according to Series 16, Episode 5 of Top Gear, Hammond also briefly held a job which involved him shoveling grit into a water filtration plant, but would very quickly gravitate back towards televisual media, and in 1988, Hammond would commence work at BBC Radio York. His first interview would be, rather funnily enough, with the Hammond Organ Appreciation Society, with a group of older church-going ladies who affirmed that Hammond's organ was the best they ever played with. The piece allegedly never made it to air, but Hammond had made his first opening mark on the broadcasting industry. 3 years later, in 1991, after getting to grips with radio, he would be moved to the corporation's Lancashire station. His first day at Radio Lancashire wasn't without incident, as he would crash the station's Ford Transit into a wall as he attempted to park up so that he could present a small piece regarding the reopening of a stately home in the area. It was during this job where Hammond would meet many of his lifelong friends, and certainly the most important of these was the very oddly named Zog Ziegler, who was the station's motoring correspondent, and the pair would frequently try to outdo each other in the hopes of eventually landing a job on TV. And though Ziegler would be the one to get a Top Gear job first, helping to present the Top Gear live radio show from 1994 alongside Steve Berry, it was actually Hammond who made it to TV first. In November 1993, Richard Hammond would briefly appear during what is believed to be his maiden television appearance during that year's BBC Children in Need telethon. Unfortunately, though part of these specials have resurfaced, all we seem to have left of Hammond's appearance is a single low-resolution freeze frame from an old YouTube upload made many years ago, which has since been long taken down. As his love of motorbikes grew, he would upgrade to faster and faster machinery, culminating with a Suzuki GSX R750 at the age of 24, which he would unfortunately be forced to sell due to a lack of money. He would take a hiatus from motorcycle riding before purchasing a Honda CBR 1000F for £1,000, which he rode everywhere. For the next few years of Hammond's life, he'd bounce around the north of England for various radio stations both within and outside the BBC, finding out that through all the people we interviewed and got into arguments with, everyone lived their own interesting life. Everyone except himself. As the 1990s continued to progress, digital television began to take off in the United Kingdom, particularly with the launch of digital satellite and terrestrial television services in 1998, which allowed the common layperson access to hundreds more channels of entertainment, channels which provided much more specialised programming than the 5 main terrestrial services could afford to broadcast. And Granada, whose influence had grown substantially throughout the first half of the decade, were keen to make a break into this strange new market where consumers suddenly found themselves spoiled in terms of how much TV they could now watch. On the 1st of October 1996, Granada would launch their lifestyle channel Men and Motors, with the aims of catering to the burgeoning 18 to 30-year-old male demographic, a channel that would not only cater to their more superficial interests as men, but also help to develop the relationship with their motors, by providing a bevy of car and motorcycle-related content exclusive to the network. After a slow and tumultuous first year on the air, Granada would make the decision to appoint Gary Shoefield to pick out a bunch of televisual talent that would help draw more viewers in. Hirings made by Shoefield included Katie Price, Gary Newman, Fufu Lamar, John Inverdale, and perhaps most bizarrely of all, American rapper Vanilla Ice. The channel would also frequently serve, perhaps rather less glamorously, as a dumping ground for presenters that simply couldn't hack it on Top Gear, such as Brendan Coogan, who joined the channel in light of his 1999 firing from the BBC after being convicted for DUI. But of the hirings the channel made with Shoefield in control, there were perhaps 3 that were the most important. The first of these was an established face that had spent 20 years on the airwaves and was a major presence on BBC's Top Gear in the 1980s through to the early 90s, a man by the name of Chris Goffey. Goffey knew how these programs were run and could help Shoefield and his colleagues to structure these new programs better than they had done in the past. The second of these hirings was Granada's own homegrown talent Ginny Buckley, a young female presenter brimming with genuine enthusiasm for the topic of cars rather than a mere face appointed to satisfy a consultancy firm's quota, or in the case of Katie Price for example, appointed for reasons not immediately obvious to some of the channel's youngest viewers. But the third of these crucial hirings was Richard Hammond. After years of being consigned to radio, Hammond's big break would finally come in June of 1998, where he received his first television gig for Men & Motor's weekly Top Gear rival Motor Week, his first piece to camera interviewing members of the public over the second-generation Renault Clio. Hammond would only appear in a mere 5 of the 25 episodes produced that time around, but for Motor Week's third series, he'd appear in 13 episodes, and by its fourth series, he'd appear in 22 of them, his screen time likewise scaling up as he was more often than not the lead presenter who introduced and closed every episode. As his role within the show grew, so too did his role within the overall network as a greater whole, and he'd eventually present a whole myriad of other car-related programs for the station through to late 2002. At that point, Hammond had moved to a town called Wendover, situated in Buckinghamshire, as it was a more convenient place for him to live in his line of work. Collaborating with producers Neil Winnington and Rob Shaw, along with their trusty cameraman Sid, this would be Hammond's life for the next half-decade of his journey to the top, during which time he'd meet Amanda Everidge, the woman that would become his wife. Over the next 4 years, Hammond would get to drive all manner of cars around the public roads that Granada Digital's shoestring budget could afford, developing his on-screen personality in the style that Shoefield and the rest of his immediate peers felt were positive steps towards success. And whereas other presenters came and went in the years that immediately followed, Granada were clearly very pleased with how quickly Hammond had adapted and how willing he was to put in the work required every single week, to the point he was one of the few personalities they chose to stick with in the long run. As you likely well know by now if you watch my videos regularly, BBC's Top Gear entered 1999, a year it should otherwise have joyously celebrated its 21st year on the air, in a state of bemused uncertainty thanks to Jeremy Clarkson's shock departure announcement at the very beginning of the year. By this point, the show had been built around Clarkson, and the BBC's lack of preparation for such a wild turn of events on a show that now ran for more than 35 weeks every single year resulted in them scrambling for new host after new host, where after 3 tumultuous series of haplessly tumbling down the ratings, it seemed as though some new form of stability had been reached. Sadly, this wasn't to last, as by the end of Series 43 in the middle of 2000, 18 months after Clarkson's departure, both Quentin Wilson and Kate Humble would choose to vacate the show for reasons that have never really been explained. Decisions which immediately cut the surviving presenting team by half, and was now a far cry from the veritable army that had worked on the show a mere 4 years prior. At this point, the production crew could definitely feel the walls beginning to close in. It's generally understood that in the search for a new Top Gear presenter, as documented in Richard Porter's autobiography, among the many thousands of hopefuls who had turned up to the auditions with stars in their eyes, 2 were ultimately shortlisted, with Hammond being pitted against South London native Adrian Simpson. Despite Porter preferring Hammond, the only reason he didn't get the job at the time was because the BBC, rather oddly, preferred the idea of building a new personality entirely from scratch, rather than put in the time remoulding Hammond from someone who would learn the ropes from Granada. In reality, this would prove to be a blessing in disguise, as Hammond was sent packing back to Men & Motors for 2 more years. Because owing to rumblings going on at the BBC involving Wilson and his former producer Richard Pearson, had Hammond won, it's very likely he'd have defected to 5th Gear a year later unless he was contractually bound to the station, like fellow hire Jason Barlow was, so in a way it's somewhat fortunate that he didn't win. He'd returned to Granada rather dejected but not all too surprised, spending the next 2 years producing various content for the network, including Motor Week, which finished for good in March of 2002 after 9 series and more than 200 episodes.
Take a good long look, because this is probably the last time you'll see us on Motor Week.
In August of the year prior, Top Gear would be axed, and the show needed some new blood to replace the old, as former producer Richard Pearson had moved to fledgling terrestrial station Channel 5 and had taken Tiff Needell, Vicky Butler-Henderson and Adrian Simpson along with a sizable portion of its production crew so they could start up a new show that would eventually become 5th Gear, which they would present along with the returning Quentin Wilson. Jeremy Clarkson was of course a dead cert for Top Gear's relaunch, as Willman had already persuaded him back onto the magazine during the closing months of 2001, and it was a job he had sorely missed doing at the time. After Clarkson rejected the BBC's original pick of Jason Barlow, Cornish car dealer Jason Dahl would be selected afterwards. After Clarkson's original pick, James May decided not to appear on the show, which left 1 or 2 spaces up for grabs. One of these would be for a professional racing driver to make full use of the newly created test track designed by Lotus, whilst the other would be for a third broadcasting partner to slot firmly between the show's 2 semi-literal pillars, Clarkson and Dahl. Among the many thousands of videotapes sent to Top Gear's makeshift production offices in BBC's White City, Hammond would send the team a demo reel of himself presenting a piece to camera with his then current company car, a Renault Laguna, which helped to get his foot in the door. But it was on the morning of the 19th of February 2002 where the fog lay dormant on the packed roads ahead as a short man and his 20-year-old Porsche with the steering wheel on the wrong side tentatively drove down the A40 to his destination at the heart of the British Broadcasting Corporation's media village. It was at this very same location which Hammond had driven to 2 years earlier, only to never hear anything back in the face of Adrian Simpson's eventual appointment. At 11 AM on that very morning, Richard Hammond's life would be changed forever. 30 minutes prior to the meeting with the White City thoroughly within his reach, Hammond would pull over and go for a short walk, leering over the footbridge at the cars going by, searching for anything to calm his racy nerves. He gazed over the dew-drizzled metal handrails, staring out into the distance as the morning sky gradually dissipated. After stopping off at a nearby B&Q for a further breather, Hammond returned to his 911 and drove the rest of the way to the studio. Upon his arrival, the first person from the BBC Hammond would meet would be none other than Richard Porter, a name which I've mentioned many times in previous videos due to his importance within the greater Top Gear canon. The pair got along well from the minute they met, talking about cars, in particular Hammond's own Porsche. It was here Hammond would be unnerved as Porter would ultimately spill the beans on the fate of his earlier attempt to become a Top Gear presenter, but he hardly allowed that to cloud his judgment as the time had finally came for him to strut his stuff. For his first live screen test, Hammond would be presented with a Skoda Superb and asked to present a piece to camera going over the car along with its various faults and features. After this, he would be made to sit down face to face with Jeremy Clarkson himself, where the pair would have a bit of a chat down the avenues of conversation for what would become the news. According to his very own words, Hammond got along fabulously with Clarkson, but it wasn't until he turned to leave that actually secured him the job, where he thanked Porter, Clarkson and Willman for the opportunity he was given before announcing, "Got to get back to the Nam, Cheltenham." This exact quip, along with the car he turned up to the audition in, would ultimately net him the job he had come so close to getting 2 years earlier, rather than anything to do with his performance. It should be noted at this point that not all of Hammond's anxiety was over the potential of securing the presenter role. At the time, his wife-to-be Mindy had birthed his first daughter, Isabella, around a year or so earlier, and Hammond needed the extra money and job security that a BBC salary would provide. Doubtful of his own potential given the previous outcome of his last attempt, as well as the fact a relative unknown such as himself would be pitted against a British televisual giant such as Jeremy Clarkson, Hammond would go home that evening in a rather dejected, sorrowful state, as he believed he would never be accepted for the show and that it would become a whirlwind success without him. Months would pass before Hammond got word of the decisive phone call which ruled in his favour and asked if he'd like to join the programme, news which caused him to burst into tears of joy and crack open a bottle of champagne in celebration. That May of that year, Richard and Mindy Hammond would decide to tie the knot, with their own daughter Izzy serving as the bridesmaid, before purchasing a house in Red Marley Dabito, a quiet green parish located in the Forest of Dean. Though Hammond would certainly continue to foster his business relationship with rival television networks over the next few years, his departure for Men & Motors was immediately effective, with the channel's decision to consider renewing its Motor Week show hinging purely on whether or not Hammond got employed by the BBC. Since he did, the programme was axed. Even so, he had still filmed enough content for the Granada network for the channel to continue airing new material featuring Hammond until 2003. And as a curious little factoid, on the night of the 1st of December 2002, Richard Hammond would appear in 2 car-related programmes for 2 different networks on the very same night. Top Gear on BBC Two, and Used Car Heaven for Men and Motors, which featured a piece on the Ferrari 360, the very same Ferrari 360 that appeared in promotional material for the first series of Top Gear. Upon finally graduating to TV's big leagues, Hammond spent the summer of his 2002 filming his first couple pieces to camera for the revived version of Top Gear before reconvening with the rest of his team that August to film the pilot episode. This would prove to be the very first test of many for our Hamster, and one that almost ended up breaking him. On that subject, for many years, people earnestly believed the Hamster moniker was first devised on Top Gear, but it was actually quite a bit before that when Hammond first got his infamous nickname, when his good friend and the notoriously camera-shy Zog Ziegler caught wind that Richard's wife-to-be Mindy was pregnant with their first daughter, to which end Ziegler proclaimed that she would be a little hamster. The nickname then became a pet name for Richard, which was then subsequently adopted into Top Gear due to Hammond's short stature and occasional tendency to eat things that aren't edible, and was likely revealed to the production crew by Hammond himself on the set of these first few shoots he'd participate in. After a disastrous initial pilot that prompted a reshoot with minimal studio lighting that likewise ended up in the bin, Hammond would quickly lose his composure and reach his wits' end. He stormed out of Top Gear's hangar, where he was met by Richard Porter, who was ill at the time and went outside to clear his airways, and threatened to quit the show if things couldn't be put in order. Thankfully, Porter successfully talked Hammond down from angrily quitting the dream job he had fought really hard for, and they would try again a little bit later in the year, with things finally going right the third time around. With everything else sorted, now it was time to see how Hammond looked on television in a program that was worked on by more than a handful of his close associates. After Jeremy Clarkson presented the first few minutes of Top Gear's first episode on his lonesome, we would be introduced to Richard Hammond by means of a very unusual and perhaps even slightly humiliating camera angle, where he then proceeded to tell us about the Ford GT40 concept car that was inside the hangar. Later that episode, he would present Top Gear's very first challenge segment involving a speed camera before a nice relaxing road test of the Mazda 6, where he says, "One of the most awkward things I've ever heard."
It's just such a shock, like discovering somebody really grey and average like John Major is a shagmeister.
At this moment in time, Top Gear was heavily Clarkson-centric, with promotional material of the program's return focusing specifically on Jeremy over anything else, including his broadcasting partners, with his two amigos more or less simply coming along for the ride. Throughout the rest of Top Gear's first series, which aired during the closing months of 2002, Hammond's role was largely relegated to road tests of low-powered economy and executive cars, along with presenting a handful of challenges such as Granny's doing donuts in the third episode, or presenting the transformation of a humble larder into a bespoke sports saloon engineered by Lotus. In Top Gear's second episode back on the air, he'd present his own twist on Eddie Kidd's infamous 1978 stunt jump that would define his life, by having the program's Stig attempting to jump 14 motorcycles in a double-decker bus, to unsurprisingly underwhelming results. Though still clearly in awe of Jeremy Clarkson, the man he had aspired to for so many years, along with the opportunity he had been given, he didn't allow this to faze him all that much and clearly saw something of a rapport developing between himself and Clarkson, as the pair frequently debated each other at length during the series' news segments, much to the detriment of third-wheel Jason Dorr. Once Top Gear had got its first few episodes in the bag and something of a consistent format had started to emerge, the show's natural dynamic had started to become clear in spite of the showrunner's original intentions. Jeremy Clarkson would remain the show's head honcho, ultimately getting his way over everyone else as he thrashed the latest supercars around the show's Lotus-designed test track. Jason Dorr, who was supposed to be Clarkson's main foil and would get a sporty car or two to drive around on occasion whilst giving the audience useful insider consumer advice, had quickly devolved into little more than the unfortunate butt of many jokes and eventually a burden whose much more outgoing personality clashed with Clarkson's brand of acidic bluntness, and despite his enthusiasm towards the job, didn't really have a face for TV. Conversely, Richard Hammond, the program's third wheel, had started to gel much more closely with the show's lead presenter. Without really saying or doing anything out of the ordinary, Hammond had overtaken Dorr as the show's second most prominent personality, and the program's showrunners took this into account as they began preparations for the show's second series. After presenting 22 films for Top Gear's first series, he would drive home for Christmas at the end of the year relatively satisfied that he had performed adequately enough to the BBC's rigorous standards in order to return to the show the following year. However, things weren't all that easy. Despite his on-screen success, contemporary critique of Hammond was scathing, to put it bluntly, with members of the Pistonheads forum in particular absolutely savaging his presence, dismissing him as an annoying gimp, among other unsavoury comments. And unfortunately, the BBC could sense his discontent, as they were not happy with the performance of either of Clarkson's co-hosts following the inaugural series of 2002 format Top Gear. And whereas Jason Dorr was deemed a lost cause, perhaps rather unfairly, and then promptly fired from the show in early 2003, Hammond's role would be saved at the 59th minute of the 11th hour by the combined efforts of his co-presenters and producers, who managed to snag James May for the show's second series, thus satisfying the BBC's desired quota of a trendy presenter who appealed to younger people. Something that's rather ironic given the sort of presenter James May would eventually turn out to be. Now a bit more conscious of his fate on the show were he not to perform up to scratch given what had happened to Jason Dorr, Hammond quickly set to work on proving his doubters wrong with a high-octane off-road test of the Bowler Wildcat to kick off Top Gear's second series, where he would perhaps most famously proclaim, "I am a driving god!" In contrast to the first series, where the fastest car he drove was a prototype TVR down country roads at a slightly brisk pace, whilst the Stig then got to thrash it around the track, Hammond would be granted access to some marginally faster and more interesting machinery for Series 2, including a variety of track day cars and the Carver 1, a Dutch tricycle with a cockpit that tilted like a motorcycle. He was also given a few classic cars to drive around and record retrospective pieces with, as he had done previously for the Citroën DS the year prior, namely cars such as the Rover P5 and Jaguar Mark II, among a couple others. Towards the end of that series, Hammond would also partake in his first jointly produced video with co-presenter James May, as the pair tested various cabriolets across Scotland, which helped to build up his on-screen experience with other hosts, and slowly but surely his personality started to come out from the blank slate that had graced our screens in Series 1. As summer dawned and Top Gear ran its infamous greatest car phone-in competition, Hammond would put forth the classic Land Rover as his personal choice for the greatest car ever made, stating that it was a truly classless car that could be enjoyed by farmers and royalty alike. Hammond would enjoy the tatty ensemble he was provided with, XFO 255 and 1956 Series 1, so much that he would end up buying it, where it sat in his garage for the better part of a decade in a state of disassembled disrepair, before he finally begun to restore it many years later. And by late 2020, almost 20 years after this segment was filmed and aired, he would only be halfway through his restoration. This adoration was well placed, however, as the Land Rover ended up winning the phone-in competition, where Hammond would proceed to celebrate at the end of the series with a scale model which he attempted to have lifted onto the lower platform of Nelson's column before Hammond and the production crew were promptly chased off by a pair of heritage wardens. Before anyone knew it, Top Gear's third series had rolled around, and to celebrate this, in addition to Hammond's win from the greatest car competition, the decision was made to give Hammond a taste of the high life previously reserved just for Clarkson. He would get to drive the new Porsche 911 GT3 around the Top Gear test track Sans Limite. It's a bit weird to mention nowadays, but during the first three series the show was clearly geared much more towards Clarkson, who was the biggest and most established star at the time, and got his first dibs on all the supercars due to his thoroughly established screen presence, along with the other hosts needing to earn that privilege. However, since Clarkson had a primal hatred of all things 911, it was Hammond who was given the chance to drive one of his motoring heroes for a change. And this film, among many others filmed around this era, was a crucial stepping stone to developing Hammond's on-screen personality. For the show's second episode, at the behest of Richard Porter, it was decided to try something a little different. Though the concept had been briefly teased in the first series, there had never actually been a single film where all three Top Gear hosts had presented a segment together. This in itself was strange, since one of the shows that had clearly inspired Top Gear's 2002 reinvention the most, Channel 4's Driven, had made 3 car comparison tests between hosts such as James May, Jason Barlow and Mike Brewer a staple of the programme, something that it had done very well, and was in fact a concept the BBC actively envied, with ex-Driven host and later Men and Motors alumnus Penny Mallory arguing that it helped to give the Channel 4 show an extra bit of pull during its early days as Top Gear went through its midlife crisis. Obviously, there was a lot of potential in filming similar segments, but likely due to the series' fluctuating fortunes at the time, the producers shied away from the concept. But with 2 series of new format Top Gear now under their belt and a 3rd on the way, it was decided to give the concept a shot. If it didn't work, they still had plenty of other ideas in the tank anyway. But if it did work, it would prove to be a vital change in the way Top Gear was presented. One that could diversify and better captivate its audience, as the first 2 series had not made the impression the BBC had perhaps initially hoped for, and given the executive meddling the corporation had instigated at the tail end of 2002, the production crew were keen on anything that prevented a second visit from their paymasters. With Top Gear filming for an extended period of time on the Isle of Man, it was decided to then film a 3-car comparison test between a triptych of sporty roadsters. Clarkson would drive the Honda S2000, May the Porsche Boxster, and Hammond in the BMW Z4. After driving their cars down the limitless Manx roads, they each attempted to argue their case as to whether their vehicle was better than the others. They would continue these arguments at the home in which they were staying at before going to a pub on the island, where these arguments resumed. In the end, it had to be settled by means of the Stig, where in the pouring rain the Boxster reigned triumphant by 0.3 of a second over Hammond's Z4, which in turn just about beat Clarkson's S2000 by a further 0.1 of a second. Though it certainly wouldn't have seemed like it at the time, this film was integral in dictating how future episodes and series of Top Gear would look, as up to that point, almost every single segment was filmed in a solo manner, with the occasional 2-host piece before reconvening in the studio for 10 to 15 minutes of solid automotive banter, which at the time was mainly built around the core wall and other similar segments. This 3-host piece broke crucial new ground, and other than Porter talking about it in his autobiography, very few people actually seem to realise the significance of the film shot on the Isle of Man. Without it, the intrapersonal relationships between the hosts would certainly have not started to develop in the way that they did, and Top Gear as a programme might have gone in a very different direction to the show we eventually grew to know and love. Because of it, we got to see many similar moments happen throughout the rest of the show's run, with Top Gear breaking its all-time viewer record since its 2002 reboot for the next 4 weeks thereafter, with viewers obviously fostering an interest in not only the bold, brash, established lead figure in Jeremy Clarkson, but also the 2 newcomers to the fray. Evidently, the production crew was satisfied over the film they had made and kept the idea in their heads as Series 3 progressed. The following week would see Hammond perform the first of his death-defying stunts. At this time, there was a bit of conflicting information as to what one should do should they find themselves in the situation where their car is about to sink underwater, which at the time the advice given was primarily to stay inside until the car completely filled up with water, at which point the air pressure would theoretically equalise and you would then be able to escape. However, upon putting this theory to the test, Hammond and by proxy Top Gear discovered something alarming. Even though the car did fill up with water, the door did not budge, and in fact wouldn't budge until well after a normal person unprepared for this scenario would have drowned. As a result, advice given to drivers who may be in a scenario where they could drown were then told to open the door before the car hit the water, or ideally avoid this situation in the first place. For Hammond, however, this was actually even worse. As he goes on to talk about in his autobiography On the Edge, the sensation was an especially surreal one for him. Sitting inside a car is a relatively normal human experience, but to sit in one as it's gently lowered into water, the car bobbing and floating as the water rushes in through each of the car's open holes, travelling up your legs as the car slowly turns into an aquarium with you inside it, is much more different than you would expect. He would sit inside, hearing the car's electrical system begin to short out, locking and unlocking the doors repeatedly as he mentally rehearsed the moves necessary to reach around the back of the car and withdraw the ventilator and air tank if he needed it. He'd only had one session of practice, and as it turned out, that would be enough, but it did little to assuage his underlying fear and panic. As it turned out, however, this was exactly the sort of thing Hammond needed. It was a natural progression from the Knievel-like stunt jumps on his bicycle he had done as a kid, and he revelled in it. Earlier that year, he partook in a 24-hour Citroën 2CV race at Snetterton alongside Ben Collins and Levi Doctrove, where the team would set the fastest lap during the event. A year after that, Hammond was once again confined within a car, in this instance a Volkswagen Golf, whilst an electrical current equivalent to a lightning strike was shot through it. In a way, Hammond had become Top Gear's own Evel Knievel, or at least the show's lab hamster. For Series 3, Episode 4, Top Gear would commemorate Lamborghini's 40th anniversary during a pseudo-special, during which Dutch television channel Veronica would attend the filming of in order to help successfully popularise the show in the Netherlands, and Hammond decided to kick things off by getting to drive his dream car from his boyhood years, the Lamborghini Miura. After this point, Hammond's role within the show started to wane just a little, as much of the rest of Series 3 was dominated between Clarkson and May's literal blockbusting attempt to see if they could destroy a Toyota Hilux. And all Hammond could really present in the meantime was a segment on Mini Cooper tuning brands and what he thought might become a classic car in the future, nominating the Mercedes-Benz 190e and the Volkswagen Corrado. However, this isn't to say that the rest of the show didn't notice and appreciate Hammond's feats and his general warmness towards the job, as for the 7th episode of Top Gear's 3rd series, Hammond would yet again be rewarded, and was allowed to road test his first bona fide supercar on the show, the Mercedes-Benz SLR engineered by McLaren. This test, which took place in South Africa not long before the car's official launch, was Hammond's first shot at presenting a piece to camera in top flight machinery away from the track, and helped to close off his 3rd series in style. This was on top of yet another joint video production, where the trio were tasked with picking the best British sports car on the market. Between Jeremy's pick of a loud and noisy Noble and James's choice of a sedate and luxurious Rover, Hamster naturally gravitated towards the nimble and retro Morgan mark, one which has remained Hammond's preferred brand for most of its adult life, even if he did rather mistakenly believe at one point in time that they still used wooden ash frames in their construction. Though the film itself, like much of the final Series 3 films, was clearly produced on a non-existent budget and forewent a more exotic location in favour of doing laps around the show's test track, it was yet another opportunity for the hosts to be themselves in front of each other and assert their own opinions without being influenced by an audience. Being able to hold his own with someone who already had such a legendary status in pop culture as Jeremy Clarkson went a long way to keeping him on screen, and the production crew and public alike gradually grew impressed with his efforts, with the previously dismissive Pistonheads and other automotive forums beginning to warm to him, if only a little.
It's like settling down in the warm and well-stocked library of a country house with a good book and a Labrador curled up at your feet and nothing to do until it's time to dress for dinner.
That said, he still had a long way to go before he could afford the car of his dreams, a classic Dodge Charger. It is rumoured that Hammond and May, prior to the show taking off worldwide, were paid much smaller figures than lead host Jeremy Clarkson. According to a highly dubious article from Piers Morgan's News of the World in December 2006, fellow host James May's contract with the BBC that year was valued at just £100,000, with only £40,000 of that coming from Top Gear. If this is the case, and not Piers merely lying at the height of his long-standing and bloody rivalry with Jeremy Clarkson, then the pair were paid roughly the same amount of money as a normal everyday desk job. By that point, Clarkson and Hammond's contracts had risen to around £1 million a year, but it stands to reason, provided this article wasn't just a bunch of unfounded mudslinging from Piers' desk, that Hammond was paid a similarly low amount for the first 2 to 3 years he spent on the show. And surprisingly enough, there is a small amount of potential evidence, both within and outside the show, that Richard Hammond was hard up on money during this period of time.
Chap here will pay you £30 to paint his mum's fence.
Is it a big fence?
Well, she wants you to be her dungeon bitch.
In early 2004, Richard Hammond would present the London Boat Show TV special for ITV, and in 2005 he also presented the Crufts Dog Show. He would also present, much to the amusement of his 2 co-presenters, the British Parking Awards for 2 consecutive years, as well as the Eastbourne Motor Show during the same weekend as the infamous 2004 Monaco Grand Prix, which both Clarkson and May chose to attend. All of these ventures were due to Hammond wanting to save up so that he could buy a Dodge Charger, and by the end of the year he had enough money to afford one. Hammond would then find a 1969 example that had been converted by its original owner into the fabled top-of-the-line RT spec, and would be imported to the UK from its original owner, who resided in Chicago. The car would then be given a once-over by Alex of Motive V8, an American car importation firm, who gave the car various performance and handling upgrades, such as Coney dampers, Wilwood brake calipers, and a manifold by Edelbrock. The car itself was then resprayed in sublime green, a colour not offered on the Charger but rather the Charger's smaller sister car, the Challenger. The hood would also be replaced by a dodgy black Ram air job that looked like it came out of Halfords, and the factory wheels would be replaced by these gopping traffic-style wheels from Japanese firm VAD. For the next year or so, this would be Hammond's choice of transport, driving to and from the studio in it, as well as appearing in the April 2005 issue of Classic American magazine. According to Ben Tate, as of 2011 the car had become a generic Dukes of Hazzard clone, having long since been sold to another owner, and its current status and whereabouts is relatively unknown. Starting from November 2003, Hammond would begin presenting Brainiac Science Abuse for digital television channel Sky One. A sort of British Mythbusters, Brainiac Science Abuse was a TV show set on making science interesting, albeit with a fair few cases of embellishment every now and then, as well as appearing to a generally dumber audience on the whole. Towards the end of 2003, with filming now largely finished for the year, Hammond would also make an appearance at the inaugural MPH live show at Earl's Court in London, the show that would eventually become the highly successful Top Gear Live. Though the event would start off small, it would rapidly increase in popularity as each successive year featured more and more elaborate performances. With Series 4 of Top Gear premiering in the middle of 2004, there was little doubt at this point that Hammond's role on the show was safe, with the series being arguably the first to show the three presenters working together as a team as opposed to three individuals headed by Clarkson. Right from the off, Series 4 would feature the race to Monte Carlo, the show's first of many races which pitted car against public transport, with Hammond and May travelling via train, including the formidable TGV, along with the show's very first cheap car challenge a mere couple of weeks later. Hammond's general camaraderie with the rest of the hosts also improved, with Hammond not afraid to take a joke about his height every so often.
And to flesh that out a little bit, here's our resident elf.
Yes!
By the time Top Gear's 5th series went to air at the end of 2004, the presenting duo of Hammond and May truly began to flourish, complementing Clarkson but not quite upstaging him just yet, through films such as Caravan Conkers, or the time they were forced to spend 24 hours with each other's company in a diminutive little smart car. Public recognition and the overall popularity of the pair had greatly soared since the beginning of the year, to the point they could no longer take anonymous test drives of particularly awful cars or put potential minicabs through their paces in front of unaware punters as they could in the 4th series just a handful of months earlier. In just 2 years, Richard Hammond had successfully managed to adapt to the life of a Top Gear presenter far better than successors who'd had a much bigger show business background such as Chris Evans, Freddie Flintoff or Paddy McGuinness ever did. That following year, Richard Hammond would be approached by the BBC to present a home video exclusive named Top Gear Revved Up. Though at its core another compilation video designed to cash in on gullible consumers, rounding up the best moments from Top Gear's 3rd through 5th series, it also featured around 15 to 20 minutes of original footage, where Hammond introduced viewers to the Top Gear production offices for the very first time, as well as giving them a bit of background into his career and early life story, part of which entailed him reading out livestock that was for sale in his neck of the woods for over an hour.
First job on Radio Cumbria, reading out the names for half an hour at a time of lambs up for adoption by local farmers.
And when Top Gear returned for its 6th series half a year later, this is where Richard Hammond would really start to come into his own as a presenter. To kick off that series in style, Toyota of Great Britain decided to use the programme as a means to debut its latest, smallest car in production at the time, the Aygo. Designed and built in the Czech Republic alongside its immediate relatives the Citroën C1 and Peugeot 107, Toyota decided exactly what should be done with the cars to launch them into the public consciousness wasn't a clever advertising campaign as Honda had done, nor was it an aggressive attack against other cars in the market. Instead, Toyota planned to have them play a game of giant football, and Hammond was tasked with filming this segment. Because what Toyota knew at the time, especially after the attempted Hilux destruction from 18 months prior, was that even though the cars were shown in a less than glamorous light, getting banged up and not espousing any of the core benefits other brands would have wanted broadcast, films like these got people talking about the cars that were in them. More importantly, films such as these would increase sales without the need of an advertising budget. For a subcompact car like the Aygo, as well as its French brethren whose sales increased in the months following the episode's broadcast, appearing on Top Gear was free publicity that rewarded the company better than any multi-million-pound advertising campaign ever could. In the immediate weeks that followed this episode's broadcast, Hammond would choose to celebrate the Ford Transit's 40th birthday by taking one to the infamous Nürburgring Nordschleife and attempting to break Jeremy Clarkson's lap time he'd set in a diesel-powered Jaguar a series earlier. He would do this with the help of demoter and future Top Gear presenter Sabine Schmitz, and though she was ultimately unsuccessful, she came a lot closer to breaking Clarkson's lap time than one might initially think. With Jeremy Clarkson slipping his discs in the middle of 2005, the show's star presenter was rendered unable to drive cars on screen as part of his doctor's orders in the middle of the show's longest ever run. Though he would somewhat disobey these instructions in order to resume driving in November 2005 for the series' upcoming Isle of Man shootout, there was a period of at least 2 to 3 months where films had to be made for Top Gear, but without Clarkson as he recovered from his injuries. And for Top Gear's 2 co-presenters, Hammond and May, this was the opportunity of a lifetime. Though their role on the show had started to increase from mid-2004 anyway, Clarkson's injury gave them carte blanche and a suitable kick up the rear to present segments on whatever they wanted, and Hammond seized the opportunity to do so. In Series 6's final episode, Hammond would present 2 supercar road tests, one on the Vauxhall Monaro VXR, which served as a crossover event with Japan's best motoring team who brought some of their highly tuned drift cars along for the ride, and one on the Lamborghini Murcielago Spider, which featured another of Hammond's daredevil stunts, this time partaking in the Pamplona Bull Run, during which Hammond was seemingly pushed by an onlooker and came within inches of being gored by a Miura bull, coincidentally part of the very same lineage that produced the bull the Murcielago's ancestor was named from. But it was in Series 7 where we really saw the relationship between the dynamic duo of Hammond and May truly shine for the first time in Clarkson's absence, and begin to develop significant chemistry. And as a sort of follow-up to his heartfelt tribute to the Rover V8 in Series 4, Hammond would produce 2 tribute films to the British motor industry. The first in Episode 2, where he documented the history of British racing green, which then served as a segue into a road test of the Van Wall GPR V12, and the second in Episode 5, where he talked about Marcos's ultimately unsuccessful attempt to revive itself with the TSO sports car. In the middle of Series 7, Hammond would partake in what was probably Top Gear's most infamous cheap car challenge, classic Italian supercars for £10,000. Though May's Lamborghini would take a trip down under and Clarkson's Maserati would languish in a scrapyard for many years thereafter, Hammond decided to keep his Ferrari and eventually get it restored to full working order. This will be an important thing to remember when we talk about the Botswana special that was filmed a couple of years later. Of the trio, Hammond was always the more sentimental of the 3 presenters towards the topic of cars. He'd grown enamoured with his little Dino, despite the fact it had left him abandoned in the middle of the motorway due to running out of petrol. As part of BBC's keenness to market Hammond to the world, he became a much more prominent face on TV throughout 2005 and 2006, darting all over the BBC and other British networks to broaden Hammond's appeal as much as possible. He'd appear in historical documentaries, talk shows and daytime TV, as well as the aforementioned Brainiac, which was becoming something of a cult classic in its own right, having now aired its 4th series by the beginning of 2006 and the last one to feature Hammond as lead host, before a rather horrific downward spiral ensued under Vic Reeves. With Clarkson already long pre-established and James May beginning to spread his wings a little, Richard Hammond became the trio's Ringo Starr figure, and not only because his name was Richard, he was the shortest and youngest of the bunch, and all the girls liked him, but because much like Starr, it was felt he too needed to have some successful side projects of his own. And rather unfortunately for Hammond, history does not seem to look favourably upon many of these series. Touted as a game show for car fanatics, Petrolheads drew quite a lot of its DNA from the automotive-related bantering that Top Gear had established itself upon, and with the likes of car nuts Chris Barry and Neil Morrissey accompanying Richard Hammond, both of whom had appeared in Top Gear a couple years prior, it was expected to go quite far in helping to bridge the gap between series of Top Gear with stunts that had clearly been cribbed from rejected scripts of past episodes. With promotional trailers featuring a challenge between 2 nuns in a Ford Fiesta, much like the Nun in a Monster Truck challenge or the Fastest Politician challenge, both of which Hammond had presided over. Sadly, despite an initially optimistic BARB report of almost 3 million viewers tuning in for the first episode of Petrolheads, within 2 weeks the figure would drop to not even half that, falling out of the weekly top 30 altogether, despite debuting at number 11. Retrospectively, it is often named as one of the worst game shows of the 21st century, and its failure could be perhaps attributed to a limited target audience, combined with an inexperienced writing staff who couldn't translate the success they'd had on Top Gear towards a more general audience just yet. Strangely, however, that was not the biggest flop of Hammond's career during that particular set of months. When the perennially popular Paul O'Grady moved to Channel 4, taking his 5 o'clock early evening show with him, ITV really thought they'd hit pay dirt by pairing Hammond with comedian Mel Giedroyc for a new daytime TV show with two of the most eminent and charismatic personalities of the era. Though it enthralled some with its different take on the format, the programme was thoroughly slammed in the press and ended after just 29 episodes had aired. Alongside Petrolheads, it too is often named as one of the worst programmes of the century thus far, and what little remains of its legacy is encapsulated within a single quip uttered by Clarkson during the Winter Olympics special to explain Richard's absence during the first couple of challenges.
Yes, he is. He's on live every afternoon, filling Paul O'Grady's slot. Just realised what I said. I know. Anyway.
By the time Series 8 rolled around, Hammond was now a very different character than the one that had first graced our screens back in 2002. Instead of the smartly dressed, sheepish at times and clean-shaven Hamster that would rattle off statistics about the Ford GT40 race car and watch the Stig perform a cool stunt every once in a while, we now had a fearless man who was often accused of whitening his teeth, and it was perhaps this daredevilry that had the potential to set up for a massive disaster. How big, we just frankly didn't know at the time. During filming for Series 8, he'd smash a Porsche Cayenne into an oncoming car driven by the production crew just after a challenge where he aimed to beat a paraglider down one of the stages then used for the Cyprus Rally, which he brushed off as a small bump but set the airbags off in his car and completely totaled the Kia rented for filming. Though a minor incident at the time, this was perhaps at least a little bit foreboding for the immediate future that lay ahead for our beloved Hamster. Following on from the success of his segment on the Toyota Aygo, Series 8 would also feature the second game of car football, this time pitting the Brazilian-built Volkswagen Fox against the older battle-scarred Aygos. Series 8 would then of course see the introduction and short-lived presenting tenure of Top Gear Dog, which Hammond naturally gravitated to the most, nicknaming her TG and taking ownership of her for the rest of her life after it was decided it would be too high maintenance to keep her on the show. In April of 2006, Hammond would buy an old K-Reg Vauxhall Forenza off of eBay in a bout of drunken online shopping, a car which Hammond soon found to be a handful as it was in a much worse state than Hammond had originally thought. Though things seemed to be continually on the up for him, unfortunately for Hammond, a massive storm was brewing on his own personal horizon, an event which threatened to destroy not only him, but Top Gear as we knew it. The general tone of Top Gear from Series 8 onwards was starting to become more openly theatrical and less serious than it had been in previous years, blurring the lines between reality and a sort of constructed kayfabe, where the hosts were often depicted getting into very tense situations and in some extreme cases even outrightly dying, yet in a rather safe manner that was otherwise clearly scripted for the cameras in the name of entertainment. This change alienated some long-term fans of the show and was perhaps detrimental towards the natural humour that would otherwise arise on the set, but was made as part of a larger conscious attempt to market Top Gear no longer as an arts and lifestyle programme as it had been marketed in the past towards car enthusiasts, but now as an outright entertainment programme with 3 key personalities, as it would then help Top Gear's bid for more merchandising opportunities, in turn helping to make the BBC more money from their intellectual property, which was always the name of the game. A key difference that had already started to emerge at this point was how the 3 hosts, particularly Hammond, were characterised, switching from faces merely presenting the content shown on screen while more trained personnel such as the Stig, Russ Swift and Top Gear stuntman did anything with a modicum of danger behind it, to distinct characters who would now often do a lot of those trickier jobs themselves. However, this change would prove to be something of a double-edged sword for the programme, with the BBC changing its primary marketing approach away from the show itself and more towards the individual personalities behind it. If anything were to happen to any of the 3 hosts, Top Gear would end up finding itself in serious trouble. And for a while now, Jeremy Clarkson's worsening osteoarthritis had led journalists to believe he would be forced to retire from Top Gear for health reasons, and that his general on-screen absence towards the end of Series 6 as a result of his slipped discs was a means of gradually easing the audience into being more accepting of the other 2 hosts once he made his seemingly inevitable departure. Of course, this never ended up happening, but were something to have happened to either of the other hosts in the meantime, that would prove to be more disastrous in the long run, as Top Gear would end up losing a lot of its established brand identity. And whereas James May was quite content to chill out and resign himself to more reserved test drives and lower risk films in general, Richard Hammond found himself taking risk after risk, as that was now an established part of his character. And what had started out rather innocently enough was now gradually escalating to high-octane stunts with increasingly thin margins for error, up to the point where in a film that never made it past the editing room, Hammond was repeatedly shot at with live assault rifle rounds behind bulletproof glass in what was little more than a Fiat Panda with pieces of shed siding stuck to it. If Top Gear didn't start to rein itself in sooner or later, someone was going to get seriously hurt.
Presumably what happened was the car, dug in, flipped, rolled...
Several times,
head came off.
Yeah.
Couldn't the same thing happen to us?
Oh, I shouldn't think so.
Right.
The torrid hot summer of 2006 was drawing to a close when Richard Hammond gleefully jogged his way up to the 4th floor of BBC's White City Media building and approached his producer Andy Willman with a simple pitch. He wanted to go really, really fast. Now, normally the presenters would give Willman these vague, tacit requests simply to annoy him, and this was no exception, except something about the way Hammond worded it immediately grabbed his attention, and Willman would duly grant Hammond's request before beginning to set things up. After considering the various means in which Hammond could go really fast, it was decided by the producers he would drive the Vampire jet-powered drag car, which in 2000 had been driven by Colin Fallows at RAF Elvington at a constant speed of exactly 300 miles per hour, which at the time was the Great British Land Speed record. Hammond was also set to drive at the very same airfield, and going against common judgment, it was decided to bring as many fire and rescue workers and their vehicles to Elvington as possible to ensure the maximum possible safety, at the utmost insistence of series producer Grant Wardrop. Hammond would return home and break this news to his family, who were less than impressed, and the notion of him going at over 300 miles per hour in what was little more than a jet engine strapped to some lightly covered scaffolding was a little too much to think about, especially given the history of the Vampire and its former sister car Hellbender, which in 1986 had killed its driver Mark Woodley and whose builder Alan Bootsy Herridge had also died in a drag racing accident, giving the cars an unenviable deathly reputation and perhaps even a curse. Just a couple of months prior to the filming of this segment, Hammond had bought himself and his wife matching Harley-Davidsons in an attempt to improve their relationship, after it had started to grow strange due to Hammond's constant stunts. Just 6 weeks before filming was due to commence for the jet car stunt, Hammond had suffered a nasty bout of whiplash as a result of tipping his Suzuki Carry van onto its side during the conclusion of the used van challenge, the effects of which he was still recovering from at the time.
He could be dead. But if he is dead and you fancy a job on Top Gear, why not write to us at I'm better than Richard Hammond was, BBC Wood Lane, London, W1270S.
Though he was certainly free to back out at any moment with James May, who was more than ready and willing to substitute for Hammond in case he didn't feel well or got cold feet, he spent the day immediately before the infamous shoot in a strangely calm and serene mood, as himself and TG had a rather chaotic but peaceful and good-natured time in a field, as the pair shot part of the tractor challenge that would later appear in Series 9, with TG running all over the place as burrs constantly got stuck to his coat. At the end of the shoot, Hammond would sit inside his rented Honda S2000 and begin the drive up to Yorkshire in preparation for the long day ahead. During initial test runs for that film, Hammond would actually break Fallows' record, achieving speeds of over 315 miles per hour multiple times, but this would not have counted since this speed was achieved during separate runs as opposed to a bi-directional average, which is what the record required at the time, in addition to an independent observer to ensure that the numbers weren't fudged in any way. Ultimately, this wouldn't matter much, as during a final extra run intended purely to gather surplus footage rather than break the speed record, the Vampire's front right tyre would fail at 288 miles per hour, destroying the suspension on that side and setting forth a chain of irreversible events that further analysis determined not even a trained fighter pilot could have avoided. In a matter of seconds, the Vampire careened off the airstrip and crashed into the grass before rolling over, with Hammond's head taking an awful lot of the brunt as the car continued to speed along the grass with Hammond unconscious throughout much of the ordeal. Those who were present at Elvington Airfield immediately feared the worst. It may have been over in a matter of seconds, but the hours and days that followed felt like an eternity. Hammond's height was rumoured to be the only thing preventing him from being decapitated by the violent impact, but even so, the immediate outlook was very grim indeed. For a certain schoolboy of just 9 years of age, who had been less than 40 miles away from where the accident had happened at the time, it was possibly the worst news he could have faced that week. Every minute after the accident felt like an hour, and every hour felt like a whole new day. Though some may retroactively point to dates such as the 4th of March 2015 as Top Gear's darkest day, I would strongly argue such a case for the 20th September 2006. Had Hammond not survived such a terrible accident, Top Gear would now be a name most often spoken in vain in the same breath as Noel Edmonds' Late Late Breakfast Show, a programme whose flagrant disregard for health and safety ended in horrific tragedy. Jeremy Clarkson and all the immediate figures surrounding Top Gear, whether the programme somehow miraculously survived such a tragic loss or not, would have been considered pariahs. Its homegrown fan base that it had built up in just under 4 years would have all but vanished, and Top Gear's legacy would forever be tarnished, allowed to drift into obscurity because of one bad film out of hundreds. Though of course there were a lot of paramedics on site thanks to Wardrop's excellent foresight, it was deemed that the injuries Hammond had sustained were far too severe to risk getting stuck in traffic or being bumped around in the back of an ambulance, potentially being involved in a second collision, so the decision was made to call 999 and ring for air assistance. Switchboard operator David Gardner would be the man responsible for arranging the air ambulance, and it's a good thing he did, as the crew were just preparing to finish their shift for the day and initially thought the call was a ruse, owing to its sheer ludicrousness. However, once they saw the expression on Gardner's face, they quickly realised something very serious had happened, and they were on the scene in minutes. As he was extricated from the vehicle and placed onto a gurney, Hammond would briefly regain consciousness but had little idea of the severity of the situation he was in, as he was still talking as though he were presenting the segment to camera. As his face swelled up from his injuries, he was loaded into the helicopter belonging to Leeds Royal Infirmary and airlifted to the city's General Hospital, where he spent the following night in critical condition. In the hours immediately following the accident, the motorways for half of the country ground to a complete standstill as a frenzied media circus had gathered around Leeds General Infirmary before Hammond's helicopter had even landed. As the number of cars, personalities connected to Hammond, and hungry journalists desperate for a scoop piled outside the hospital, everyone from truck drivers to worried parents concerned on their child's behalf drove past with honks of appreciation and encouragement that Hammond would make it through alive. Newsstands were already reporting the accident a whole 12 hours before they'd even get newspapers in, and once they did, Hammond's face dominated the news on a national scale. Almost every single major British newspaper dated to the 21st of September 2006 had a photo of Richard Hammond's face on it, along with varying recorded speed figures depending on the source. Media coverage of Hammond's accident was so absolute that according to the late Alex Mills, it was even covered in America, although no newsreels talking about his accident appeared to have survived. Placed into a medically induced coma, Hammond's condition gradually worsened, scoring just a 3 on the Glasgow Coma Scale, the lowest possible score before death. As he drifted in and out of varying stages of consciousness, he eventually sunk into a deep coma, where he had the most vivid dream of his entire life that involved him embarking on a long walk through the Midlands with a strange sense of foreboding until he approached this very tree, at which point he sensed something was very, very wrong and eventually awoke. It turned out the whole time Mindy had been at Hammond's bedside, begging him not to die, and these words had somehow found their way into Hammond's subconscious as a feeling of dread. As the hours ticked by at an agonisingly slow rate, with the country united in prayer for his well-being, Hammond would thankfully pull through, and Grant Wardrop's careful preparation was ultimately what likely saved Hammond's life. Now, despite the BBC and certain individuals' attempts to retroactively write the Top Gear fanbase out of its own story, it was Pistonheads of all places who decided to set up a fundraiser for the Yorkshire Air Ambulance, which not only highlighted the British populace's changing attitude towards Richard Hammond from a group of people who had otherwise been unceremoniously calling him a gimp 4 years prior, but also the country's emergency services that had helped to get Hammond out of that wreckage and into hospital. donations to the air ambulance would surpass £200,000 in a matter of days in spite of a cruel trickster's attempts to derail the fund, which meant they could buy another helicopter for future incidents. What's to me perhaps one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the accident, and something that is hardly ever mentioned in retrospective discussion, is that once he was loaded into the helicopter, Hammond slowly started to piece together what had happened and thought he was still stuck inside the dragster, begging those around him to save him. The flight only took 12 minutes, but for Hammond and paramedic Darren Axe, it was the longest 12 minutes of both their respective lives. During the flight to Leeds Royal, Axe tried to calm Hammond down by asking him about his family, which seemed to work. The news travelled fast, and within a matter of minutes his wife found out about the accident through the family's Polish au pair, Ella, with Mindy's phone receiving a flurry of texts and missed calls from Andy Willman. Jeremy Clarkson and his wife at the time, Francine, were next to know, with Mindy calling her husband's parents along with his editor at the Daily Mirror, Katrina, and letting her know about the accident, only to then find out the majority of big-name tabloids in the United Kingdom were already somehow aware of this and preliminarily reporting on the accident. And by the time the 6 o'clock news cycle rolled around that evening, 60 million other people in the country would soon be made aware of the accident.
The Top Gear TV presenter Richard Hammond is tonight critically ill in hospital after crashing at 280 miles an hour. He was driving a jet-propelled car at an airfield near York as part of a land speed record attempt programme.
As the hours progressed, Willman was the first member of the Top Gear crew to arrive at the hospital, with Mindy turning up a good while later due to the high traffic build-up and the much further drive north she'd had to conduct. Hammond was in a grim condition once they arrived, with clods of dirt that had been kicked up during the accident still on his face, which had now swelled further into a horrid green colour, along with a badly swollen left eye and dried blood in and around his nostrils. Mindy squeezed Hammond's hand for a response, but there was none, as the entire left side of his body was left temporarily paralysed. Hammond would eventually begin to regain consciousness a day or two after the initial event, but for very brief periods, with Hammond violently lashing out at whatever was in front of him. This included monitors, drips, and any nurse unfortunate enough to try and shine a torch in his face. From there, his physical condition steadily improved. He would spend 2 weeks in total from the night of the accident through to leaving on his own steam, with his mind state largely regressed to that of a child. He would find playing with Lego and Top Trumps cards to be the most mentally stimulating things to occupy his time with, as well as picking up an unexpected taste for celery, and would finally be discharged that October. With Hammond now having completed the bare bones of his slow return to normality, another media storm began brewing concerning the future of Top Gear, which was still up in the air following the suspension of its best-of compilation programs not long after the accident. In fact, so broad was the suspension of Top Gear programming that allegedly even UK TVG2, the channel that would later become known as Dave, also preemptively suspended its regular Top Gear reruns in favour of Top of the Pops reruns instead. With no Top Gear on British airwaves at all for much of October 2006, demand for the programme soared. And once the smoke had cleared by November, the BBC decided to test the waters, airing a final best of compilation on BBC Two, which would typically only garner a couple million viewers, if even that, but this time around very nearly beat out a brand new episode of Torchwood, one of the BBC's hottest science fiction properties at the time. Though Jeremy, James and Andy Willman were steadfast in their assertion that Top Gear could and would continue with or without Hammond, given the show's burgeoning popularity, concerns were raised that the show had gone too far with the vampire stunt and needed to be cancelled. Hammond's original desire was for Top Gear to continue in October 2006 with the show's 9th series without his presence in the studio. Though this could have been good for ratings and kept the show on schedule to air its 10th series in the summer of 2007, the rest of the team opted to wait for Hammond to recover first. This news caused Hammond to enter a depression, assuming that the show would be cancelled because of him, that because he'd been irresponsible and crashed a vampire jet car, Top Gear would be taken off the air for good and he'd no longer have the dream job he'd loved doing for over 4 years. It is therefore no coincidence that Beta 6 was more or less established in the direct fallout of Hammond's accident, which, based on all publicly available information and news headlines concerning the company's creation over some unverifiable anecdotes, was founded specifically to allow Top Gear to be more flexible in its future TV deals, including the very real possibility of a Top Gear BBC intellectual property split further down the line, as was speculated several months later in the press following discussions with ITV's Simon Fuller. Though he was now firmly on the road to recovery, the accident had more than left its mark. It had caused Hammond temporary aphantasia, an inability for Hammond to imagine. This meant for a short while Hammond was 100% aware of everything going on around him, on top of a particularly strong bout of amnesia to boot. As Hammond's recuperation continued to go well, neurosurgeons John Holloway and Rick Nelson made the decision that he needed to ease back into some form of a normal life, and to do this without the paparazzi or news media hounding him at every corner. A plan was hatched which involved Hammond and his family being driven discreetly to the Scottish Highlands in a Winnebago so that he could have a week or two on his own. With each day that passed, Hammond continued to rapidly improve, remembering entire year-long stretches of his life where they were previously blank. By December of 2006, Richard Hammond would make his first television appearance in several months on Jonathan Ross's Friday night talk show, where he would invariably talk about his accident. As the pair conversed with each other, Hammond would announce his intention to participate in a race to the North Pole, which would be filmed early the following year. Hammond would also win Heat magazine's Weird Crush of the Year, which instigated a Top Gear three-peat that lasted through to 2008. Hammond would also place 32nd on the Daily Mail's list of the world's 100 sexiest men, which was announced at the beginning of the following year. For the January 2007 issue of Top Gear magazine, Hammond would disclose an in-depth look into his accident for the first time, revealing many details that were previously unknown to the press and cradling his damaged, mud-caked RAE helmet he wore for the film. Finally, on the 24th of January 2007, 4 days before the first new episode of Top Gear was scheduled to air, Richard Hammond would return to Top Gear in style in front of a live studio audience. Emerging from the top of a set of aircraft stairs and surrounded by dancing cabaret girls to the tune of Diana Ross's Upside Down, it marked a momentous return for the beloved Hamster. 4 days later, once filming and editing was said and done, the episode would go to general broadcast on BBC Two. This was an extremely important night for the BBC, one they couldn't mess up, as Series 9's delayed premiere meant Top Gear would be going up against Celebrity Big Brother, a show which at its peak, along with parent show Big Brother, would regularly attain viewing figures of over 5 million, which Top Gear at this point were yet to beat outside of one or two outliers. To put it bluntly, it was David versus Goliath. The structure of the episode was designed in such a way that viewers were basically forced to stay and watch the entire episode, thus guaranteeing viewers would be drawn away from BBC Two's immediate rivals, before the crash was eventually shown for the first time in full. Though it would become something of a joke lampooned even by Hammond himself in later years, there was no sound in the studio other than a stunned, murmured silence and a crescendo of genuine applause for Hammond, who survived such a harrowing accident that no one should ever have to experience, with not only his life but his mental and physical faculties completely intact. The subsequent success of Top Gear would see the show absolutely smash Celebrity Big Brother in the ratings and saw the program begin to take off worldwide. For better or worse, Top Gear was now a hit, with Hammond back in the saddle.
15 months they said it would take you to recover.
Yeah.
And yet, that was September. You were back on Top Gear in the spring.
Do you know, I don't remember that. I don't remember doing it.
Are you serious?
Oh, no, I don't remember a thing about that series when I first came back. But it was, with brain damage particularly, I think, they can't stick a dipstick in your head and see exactly how it's working.
Yeah.
So there really is no way of knowing. So all they've got is statistics, and all the indicators were I'd be there for a long time, but I made it.
And you were out, and you're back working again. And
well, assuming I am, unless I'm in a hospital room now, and this is not...
And this is all a terrible dream.
Yeah.
Though he does not recall much of this series and in fact struggles to recall in general due to his accident and the injury that it incurred, having Hammond in the studio was a necessary and consensual choice made between both the rest of the Top Gear crew and Richard Hammond himself, and proved to be a necessary evil in bringing the program to the very top. At Hammond's personal request, this episode was permanently dropped from the archives not long after it had concluded its original broadcast cycle. Unlike every other episode from Series 6 onwards, it would never be reshown on BBC Three, and only appeared on BBC America for the channel's first 3 years until its last known airing in May of 2010. NTV in Russia, which had been among the first channels in the world to broadcast Top Gear for an international audience, would also translate and broadcast an abridged version of the episode after being given special dispensation by the BBC to do so for one night only. Strangely, however, it's known that Discovery, who handled the syndication of Top Gear throughout much of mainland Europe, continued to air a version of Series 9 Episode 1 as recently as 2010, perhaps unaware of this decision. The episode would be replaced by the Winter Olympics special in the German Series 9 DVD box set and was never made available on iPlayer until the beginning of the 2020s. Naturally, Hammond's accident also had the potential to spell disaster for the fledgling success of Top Gear Live, who were about to hold their very first ever international live show in Johannesburg, South Africa, during a string of shows that was set to determine whether or not the BBC would go all in with the event that Clarkson and a handful of his close associates, including Philippa Sage, had devised almost entirely independently from any official BBC production. Though these shows would occur in February 2007, 2 months after the British leg concluded, Hammond wasn't expected to have recovered enough to complete the tour, with Fifth Gear and former Top Gear host Tiffany Dell again ready to deputise in the event Hammond wasn't ready, as he would do during the shows in London and Birmingham. However, after some formal discussion with Mindy Hammond, Richard decided to join the tour for its final leg, accompanying Clarkson as well as local talent Sasha Martinengo. A few weeks following Hammond's return, Hammond would present a segment recorded prior to the accident which involved him and James May attempting to turn a Reliant Robin into a rocket ship. This would of course go pear-shaped through no fault of their own, as the bolts which held the Robin to the boosters failed to detach. But it really helped to typify the programme's ambitious but rubbish aura that it had been building towards for the past couple of years at this point, and firmly established that the programme was no longer in any immediate danger of being cancelled, in spite of what many tabloids of the era had to say. However, even with turning the United States road trip into a full-length episode, a move that was unprecedented at the time and turned out to be a masterful stroke of genius, it was very likely that Top Gear's 9th series would be ending early after just 5 episodes due to how filming terminated immediately following Hammond's accident. What the programme really needed to tie Series 9 all together and finish up with a respectable episode count was to produce one final big film with Hammond getting back behind the wheel once more. Obviously, it didn't have to be a supercar, which might very well have finished Hammond off, but it had to be something he could drive in front of a camera, to prove he was capable of not only sitting down on a couch and hosting Top Gear, but actually presenting it again. Enter the Stretch Limousine Challenge. Filmed just 5 months after his accident, the challenge marked the first time Hammond had got behind the wheel of a car for televisual purposes since his accident, and as a result, this necessitated the help of his co-presenters and Andy Woolman to instruct Hammond on what he needed to do. This challenge was crucial in proving Hammond was still able to present Top Gear and had not developed an aversion to cars. As the team drove around the labyrinthine London roads in the hunt for Earl's Court, which in James May's case proved to be rather futile, the sheer amount of people who filmed or captured pictures of the team in action, especially Richard Hammond, was yet another testament to just how popular Top Gear had grown not just since its 2002 revival, but during the 18 months leading up to the episode's broadcast, and especially during the winter since Hammond's accident. We had seen similarly large public audiences gather during the aforementioned Italian Supercar Challenge, for instance. What happened during the Stretch Limo Challenge was more akin to a citywide mobbing. Onlookers gazed out of their multi-story flats in awed curiosity. School pupils changed their routes home just to catch a glimpse of their heroes in action, and mere pedestrians took on the role of an impromptu paparazzi, who hounded each of the hosts at every set of traffic lights they had the misfortune of stopping at. Again, this part of the challenge was filmed only 2 days after the team's final date in Johannesburg, so not only was Richard Hammond rather dazed as his brain was not yet functioning at 100%, but he was also probably jet-lagged to boot. On the whole, the film was a massive success, helping Top Gear to close off its 9th series with a momentous 8.12 million viewing figure, proving to the BBC that its earlier performance was not a fluke. And whether through compassion or not, Richard Hammond's choice to place the show above his own personal well-being did not go unnoticed, and he would duly sweep up the award for Best Digital TV Personality at that year's Trick Awards show for his work on Brainiac. Almost 20 years having passed since the last time he was in a band, Top Gear of the Pops was a last-minute charity special made to replace The Question of Comedy, which never went to air and remains a piece of lost media. In a way, Hammond got to achieve his boyhood dream that never was, performing with an instrument live in front of an adoring audience, along with musicians from the band Supergrass, of which drummer Danny Goffey was the son of presenter Chris Goffey, the man that Hammond had worked with at the dawn of his televisual career, and The Darkness, whose Justin Hawkins had previously appeared on the show a couple years prior. To say that the BBC made the right call would be more than somewhat understated, as the programme attracted 6.4 million viewers to BBC Two, which was again a very high rating for Top Gear, especially for an episode where not a single car was driven. Sadly, however, as Top Gear continued to get bigger and bigger, the show would eventually outgrow even the yearly charity specials, with Top Ground Gear Force in 2008 marking the last time a special was commissioned, unless you include this aberration from 2012, which I personally don't. The last time Top Gear would properly do something special for good causes would come during 2008's Children in Need, with Hammond yet again ending up on the same program that had arguably birthed his televisual career. Starring as himself in Fire Up the Quattro, a semi-serious skit designed to take place within the time-displaced world of Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, the skit entailed Hammond getting behind the wheel of Gene Hunt's iconic red Audi Quattro and taking D.I. Alex Drake for a spin around the car park. 1 month following the airing of Top Gear of the Pops, the program embarked on its most ambitious special yet, the Top Gear Polar Special, where the team embarked on a journey to reach the 1996 magnetic North Pole and become the first to do so in a car. Despite being filmed just a handful of months after Hammond's accident, Richard would accompany American explorer Matty McNair as the pair raced against Jeremy Clarkson and James May, who were in a specially prepared Toyota Hilux built by Icelandic firm Arctic Trucks. In order to give Hammond adequate preparation time, he would arrive in northern Canada a full week before his two co-presenters, as he could learn how to adequately dog sled in the harsh conditions. Once the race was on, a handful of cameramen on ski-doos would accompany the pair so they could be filmed in action and to report back to base in case Hammond's condition worsened. Though the two would be invariably beaten, the pair of Hammond and McNair would make it a decent way across the territory even as their intrapersonal relationship grew strained. To avoid being too harsh on Hammond, it was decided for him to abandon McNair without reaching the finish line and be evacuated via ice plane along with Clarkson and May, as it seemed unnecessarily cruel for the pair to gloat over their victory given the past several months of events which had transpired. As summer once again returned, July 2007 would prove to be a very busy month for Richard Hammond. In addition to the Polar Special going to air, filming would then commence of the upcoming Botswana Special, where the trio were tasked with travelling from the Zimbabwean border to the edge of Botswana, crossing the lifeless, deserted Okavango Delta in the process, as well as the Makgadikgadi salt pan. This special attempted to prove that you didn't need a rough, tough 4x4 to cross the harsh desert sands, with Hammond choosing a 1963 Opel Kadett as his weapon of choice. As he drove the car across the country, he developed an interesting relationship with the Kadett, eventually christening it Oliver and making sure it was kept safe from harm before having it delivered back home to the UK, where it would be meticulously restored by a team from Practical Classics magazine. Speaking as a whole native, I was more than well acquainted with the 2007 floods, and although we weren't personally affected, I knew many people whose lives were changed on those fateful days, and all across the country, these floods caused mayhem. As he drove home in the early hours of the 21st of July during a journey that had already taken 12 hours, Hammond's Porsche would be stranded by floodwater, and this nearly caused him to miss his second daughter Willow's 4th birthday. Instead of asking for assistance or foregoing the occasion entirely due to the danger he was in, Hammond instead decided to make the wild decision to take his iPod in the complete pitch-black darkness of rural England, filled with wolves, foxes and other things that may prey on short brummies, and sprinted the final 16 miles through the English countryside between Cheltenham and Bromsberrow, where the Hammond family were situated at the time. He would arrive home safely at 5:30 AM and spent the day with his wife, daughter and birthday girl Willow. This new Hammond was absolutely selfless and would prove to be not the only altruistic act he'd do that weekend. Over in the small parish town of Much Markle, Hammond's good friend Zog Ziegler resided in a riverside house, and though he'd taken the precaution of installing some very expensive pumps designed to stymie the flow of floodwater, these were soon overwhelmed by the unprecedented amount of standing water, and by Sunday morning things were bleak. Ziegler and his wife had piled their prized possessions onto a table, but as the floodwaters rose, these threatened to drift away. Given how much of his livelihood he owed to Zog, Richard Hammond spared zero hesitation in donning a wetsuit and arriving to the Zieglers' house in a wooden boat, rescuing them and allowing them to stay at his house until the waters dried up as an act of gratitude for having stuck with him all those years ago. So, other than his biggest journey hitting the airwaves, a dangerous jaunt across uncharted Africa in a lovely little Opel, running more than half a marathon in the pitch black to make it to his daughter's birthday on time, and saving his best friend from perishing in the deadliest British flood in almost a century, surely the rest of his month was a little less hectic, right? That very same month, Hammond would be given one chance and one chance only to meet his childhood hero Evel Knievel, who unfortunately didn't have that much time left as the symptoms from his terminal lung disease worsened. Hammond seized that opportunity by flying over to America and filming a rather interesting documentary of Knievel's final days. Critical reception to this special was mixed, with some praising it for providing a more raw, unfiltered introspective into Knievel's life and depicting him as a troubled, bitter old man with a shining past that had tarnished in later years, without the need for post-productive sugarcoating, and others deriding it for Hammond choosing to put up with Knievel's rancid behaviour on the set and not allowing it to cloud his personal judgment of his hero. To deviate from the script a little, I am of the belief that if you do choose to meet your hero and they weren't all they were cracked up to be, at least you got the chance to meet them, and Hammond can certainly say this in regards to Knievel. 4 months after filming concluded and 1 month before the special went to air, he'd succumbed to his illness, and the resultant special would air immediately after Top Gear's 10th series finale, where it was watched by 4.5 million people. However, as the year-long anniversary for his crash quickly crept upon him, there was one final obstacle for Hammond to overcome, to truly move on and leave it in the past, and that was to drive a really fast car at speed down an airstrip, to relive the events of the previous year and come out on top victorious. In the September of 2007, Hammond would arrive at RAF Koningsby and would be reunited with the fire crew that had helped to save his life a year earlier, as well as many adoring fans who were overjoyed their beloved Hamster was alive and well. For the challenge, he would wear a helmet that had been designed and graciously donated by members of the Final Gear forums, which featured Hammond as an anthropomorphic hamster behind the wheel of a caricaturized Pagani Zonda. Jason Fowler and his firm JLF Designs would be tasked with painting the helmet based on the original design put together by several people on the forum, including Amuri, the sister of website founder Alex Mills, and the helmet would be handed to Hammond in May of that year. Though they weren't allowed to publicly acknowledge Final Gear's existence for legal reasons, the helmet was prominently featured during the episode. Racing against the Veyron would be the Eurofighter Typhoon, with the aim of seeing which of the two ultra-high-speed vehicles could make it to their finishing point first. The Typhoon ultimately won the race in the most technical sense, reaching its finishing point a considerable amount of time before the Veyron could, but ultimately that didn't matter. Hammond's triumph over speed was a far more important battle, and he had won it with flying colours. Finally, as a sort of crowning achievement for overcoming his fear of speed, Hammond would also receive the opportunity to take the 2005 championship-winning Renault R25 Formula 1 car out for the ultimate track day, fulfilling a dream many men and children alike have probably had at some point, to drive an F1 car, and after this, Hammond was mostly back to his old self. As Series 10 continued to wind Top Gear to an ever greater crescendo, Richard Hammond started to get his life back on track, with the program acting as a sort of extremely unconventional physiotherapy as his memory and motor skills continued to recover. Though his work schedule was clearly reduced for Hammond's benefit, appearing in only 13 of Series 10's 28 total films, of which 10 of those were joint productions with at least one other host, he still managed to undertake some impressive feats, such as 3 attempts to cross the English Channel in a VW campervan completely unassisted before it capsized, after which point he jumped ship to Clarkson's Nissan, which ended up successfully docking at Songat a couple of hours later, forming an active part of the Top Gear team's attempt to win their class in the Britcar 24-hour race using the fuel they had harvested the year prior in what was then Hammond's second 24-hour race of his career, and perhaps most notably of all, winning a race to the centre of London on a bicycle of all vehicles, somehow surviving London's brutal rush hour traffic and coming out on top victorious. In the past year leading up to this point, he'd had a major accident, fully recovered, raised enough money to give the Yorkshire Air Ambulance Service a second helicopter, travelled the world, meeting his idol in the process, and still found the time to entertain millions of his devoted fans, all the while coping and adapting to the more longer-lasting symptoms of his accident. Sadly, it seems in this world it doesn't matter how many good deeds you may do or how many mountains you overcome, someone will find a way to hate you for it. And in this instance, it was a certain comedian ex-classmate of Hammond's by the name of Stuart Lee. For those outside the UK who might not be aware of who this man was, Stuart Lee is basically a comedian that built up his career by being the personification of a lifelong 14-year-old edgelord, unsurprisingly championed by colleagues who thought comedy was actually about shouting class warfare down your viewers' throats, instead of just having a good laugh regardless of who you were or what your social status was. and enjoyed by audiences of embittered and otherwise easily offended busybodies who stuff their online handles with as many emojis as the websites will allow, yet are probably more out of shape, lighter and sweatier than Jeremy Clarkson at a Caribbean beach, and twice as old to boot. In the name of human decency and maintaining as professional outlook as I can, I will not repeat nor promote what Lee said, but it was very, very awful. The only way you really deal with people like these in the most professional manner possible without dragging yourself down to their level is to just say nothing and let their words embarrass themselves. What the majority of the final half hour of this documentary will cover will largely focus more towards Hammond's ventures independent from Top Gear, as opposed to recounting every last thing he did on the show. On the 5th of October 2007, Hammond's first autobiography, On the Edge, would hit store shelves and quickly become a Times bestseller in the process. The biography recounted publicly for the very first time how Hammond was first selected to be a part of Top Gear, as well as dedicating a lot of intimate details regarding his accident and subsequent recovery. The book was a particular hit with those who had or knew someone who was recovering from a brain injury, as Hammond would espouse his support for that particular cause. Building upon the success of his first autobiography, he'd quickly pen a sequel that recounted the year's events to the best of his ability, which would be titled As You Do, before completing the trilogy with a more direct sequel to his original work titled Or Is That Just Me, releasing in 2009. He'd further recount his earliest years with his fourth and most recent autobiography titled On the Road, which released in 2014. After the success of Revved Up from a couple of years prior, the BBC decided to commission more Top Gear home video exclusives, as Hammond was ready and willing to produce them, the first of these being an interactive DVD quiz imaginatively named Richard Hammond's Interactive Challenge. I can't find any sales figures to gauge just how successful this release actually was, but it was evidently successful enough to warrant a sequel in 2008, named Richard Hammond's Stunt Challenge. It was here we saw Hammond's Forenza for the first time in 2 years, as well as the Land Rover he bought from Top Gear 5 years earlier. Starting from 2008, Hammond would decide to front British supermarket chain Morrison's advertising campaign, during which he would be paid £750,000 for just 4 days of work. During these adverts, Hammond would put particular emphasis on the Britishness of Morrison's, in addition to referencing some aspects of his life and career, such as pushing his trolley through what is clearly supposed to be the Pamplona Bull Run, which he'd partaken in just a handful of years prior. Scheduling conflicts meant Hammond forfeited his chance to drive the Pagani Zonda F Roadster for the 12th series of Top Gear, a duty which would instead unusually fall to his co-presenter James May. Up to this point, other than the original Zonda from the first episode which Clarkson drove by default, Hammond had driven every successive iteration of the hypercar made up until that point, having driven the Zonda Roadster in Series 5, the Zonda F in Series 7, and choosing a Zonda for the road trip down to the south of France, which also aired in Series 7. Missing the chance to drive yet another Zonda seemed rather out of character for Hammond, but with the money he earned from these adverts, just days later Hammond would splash £2 million on Bollitree Castle, a folly located in Weston-under-Penyard, where he and his family reside to this very day, before returning to Top Gear to resume his hosting duties. Eventually, in the face of Jeremy Clarkson's successful solo presenting career that dated back to the 1990s, and now James May's successful solo presenting career which took off with his wine tasting series with Oz Clarke, as well as his various productions surrounding the toys of himself and his sister, 2008 was the year Richard Hammond would go his own way for the very first time, presenting Richard Hammond's Engineering Connections for the Discovery Channel. This series delved into how modern feats of engineering could credit the most primordial aspects of nature for their existence, and among many other machines and structural feats, Hammond would return to the Mio Viaduct which he had driven over in his Pagani Zonda just a matter of years earlier. Throughout that year, Hammond was rumoured to be at the forefront of the BBC's £200 million broadcasting deal with Formula One, with Hammond taking the potential role of commentator. However, despite repeated insistences by various outlets, this never happened to my knowledge, unless he was an occasional radio presenter, which seems just as doubtful. He certainly didn't take over hosting on TV, and even if he did, this would have left little time for him to film his commitments to Top Gear and participate in its many live shows, and simply would not have been feasible to cart him halfway across the world for 15 or more weeks a year when he was already working that long filming at the Top Gear studio in Dunsfold. Realistically, unless Hammond chose to quit Top Gear, he would not have been able to fulfill the BBC's demanding schedule unless he voluntarily missed half of the season. On the 3rd of January 2009, viewers of BBC programming would start to see a whole lot more of Richard Hammond during the coming months, as during that day 2 new series involving him premiered for the first time across the BBC. Richard Hammond's Blast Lab, a science-themed game show aimed at children, and Total Wipeout, a British adaptation of the American game show Wipeout, filmed in Argentina. Though he'd fallen off his horse that same month and be forced to hobble around on crutches for a while, this injury didn't have that much of an effect on Hammond's broadcasting capabilities, since most of his shows had already been filmed in advance. In April 2009, Hammond would partake in Top Gear's biggest race yet, the Race to the North. Although much of this race was plagued by various technical problems, chiefly Hammond's inability to get his vintage Vincent Black Shadow started, he fell in love with the motorcycle and has wanted one ever since to add to his collection. He would similarly fall in love with a Lanchester 14, which he mistakenly believed his grandfather may have built for a classic car rally in Mediocre.
My granddad built this car.
Granddad didn't do the gearbox.
That's a Daimler gearbox. My granddad didn't build that bit. That was somebody else.
As Top Gear's landmark Series 13 was broadcast, Hammond would open a £7 million facility in Surrey for children who suffered similar injuries to those incurred by Hammond during his vampire stunt. He would also be named Vice President of the Children's Trust, where he remains a celebrity ambassador to this day. In the second half of 2009, during the time in which Top Gear was off the air, Hammond followed up his horse riding accident from the beginning of that year with a scary crash involving his Morgan that ended up instigating a 4-car pileup that August, before tearing ligaments in his feet during a woodland run that again necessitated the use of crutches. He would buy a Robinson R44 helicopter valued at £150,000 just months after the helicopter himself and Jeremy Clarkson were flying in over Auckland, New Zealand to partake in that leg of their 2008 to 2009 World Tour, struck a seagull on takeoff and was forced into an emergency landing. Thankfully, none of this interrupted the filming or broadcast of Top Gear's first high-definition series, which closed out 2009 and saw the programme win Channel 4's Nation's Favourite Programme award, which Hammond was eager to collect along with his 2 co-presenters, in recognition of their hard work. At the end of the year, the BBC's home video department had a bit more of its budget to play with, and Richard Hammond produced and released Top Gear Uncovered during the same month when co-host Jeremy Clarkson released his 14th consecutive yearly home video, Duel. Uncovered was a decidedly less flashy affair than Clarkson's offering, as it was mainly comprised of much smaller, safer stunts which accompanied the general narrative of what it was like to film an episode of Top Gear. During this time, but more particularly the 2 years leading up to 2010, Richard Hammond took on what many of his fans feel to be his most distinctive appearance, which was a far cry from the glorified tea towel he had worn on day one. A dark brown leather jacket, a necklace with wooden cubes, and a noticeably shaggier, greasier hairstyle certainly helped to give the show's Hamster his definitive appearance, alongside Clarkson's eternal obsession with denim and May's signature pink and purple striped shirt. To cap off such a momentous decade for Richard Hammond, for his 40th birthday, his wife Mindy would arrange an absolute blowout, with every single person that had helped Hammond's career during its first 20 years cordially invited to Hammerlot to celebrate the occasion of what was almost certainly his most expensive special day to date, kicking off his 40s in style with a top-of-the-line Kawasaki Ninja, Aston Martin DBS Volante, and Jaguar E-Type manufactured the same year as Hammond's birth. And at such a spiritual crossroads in one's life, Hammond could easily have chosen to walk away from show business with his head held high in order to focus on what mattered to him the most, his family. He'd now starred in 14 critically acclaimed series of Top Gear, participated in hundreds of memorable films, toured the world several times over, and had came back from the literal brink of death in the most triumphant manner possible. But much like his co-presenters and producers who had now become something of an extended family, Richard Hammond was no longer doing this for himself. He was doing it for the 350 million of us cooped up in expensive London flats, gloomy Romanian pubs, and downtrodden Iraqi villages alike. And whether you lived in Hull or Hamburg, Hammond wanted to be there on your TV screens for at least 10 to 15 hours a year. In June 2010, having now had a few years to reflect on his accident, Hammond would star in a documentary alongside Sir Sterling Moss, which aired on BBC4, where the pair discussed their career-changing accidents. Moss's occurring during the 1962 run of Goodwood, an accident which shook Moss so terribly that he vowed never to race again. Hammond felt that discussing his accident with a venerated legend of the motor racing community gave him the necessary closure to finally move on with his life and to be thankful that his accident had occurred in an era with much more in the way of safety than Moss's did. With Series 15 of Top Gear going to air immediately afterwards, what was probably Hammond's most infamous moment that time around was the cut-and-shut BMW M3 he purchased for the budget 4-door Super Saloon Challenge in Germany. He would register a YouTube channel, Mr. M3 Man, in the same way his two co-presenters did for the purposes of anonymously uploading a commentated lap of the Euro Speedway Lausitz. But for whatever reason, the camera did not function correctly during the challenge, meaning instead, Hammond uploaded a video of a test card and himself doing his best impression of a 3.2-litre BMW S50 engine.
And I'm off! And listen to that straight six!
The funniest part of this being his video got more views than the other two. Due to the success of the previous year's Top Gear Uncovered release, in 2010 the successive Top Gear home video Apocalypse would be filmed in high definition for the first time and featured James May as well, and unlike the previous year's offering, it was far more adventurous than what even Clarkson was offering that year, with a post-apocalyptic MOT test segment so obviously inspired by Robot Wars that it honestly has to be seen to be believed. So if you haven't seen it already, please do watch it. This would then be followed by Top Gear at the movies a year after that, before Hammond took a year's hiatus from filming home videos to concentrate on his obligations in America. Even so, during the subsequent year's Worst Car Ever home video, Hammond's two co-presenters made sure he wasn't completely left out, by temporarily removing his Ford Mustang from the driveway and replacing it with a Lexus SC430 as a gift from them to him. 2011 was a bit more of a dramatic year for Hammond. The show already rocked by the very vocal public departure of former Stig Ben Collins, who left the show in a huff. Series 16 Episode 2 would see Hammond and May partake in a very ill-advised spot of bantering over a Mexican car company, Mistretta, who decided to enter the world of sports cars, with Hammond calling the country's citizens feckless, flatulent and lazy. This ballooned into a controversy where many people's ire were oddly drawn towards Clarkson, who was the only person to say nothing of controversy during that particular instance of the news, other than giving a knowing look to the cameras. And the infamy of the pair's comments ended up dwarfing the car's legacy, with Mistretta slowly fading into obscurity before seemingly shutting up shop in 2019. For his role in saying these insensitive comments, Hammond would ultimately be humbled and forced to test drive the MXT in Mexico, which he would do so under the flimsy disguise of a mustache 3-hole series later, after losing a race to the Mexican border after Hammond's two co-presenters collaborated with one another to meddle with his SRT Viper and sabotage its engine. Sadly, these comments only served to damage Top Gear's reputation in the long run, particularly in Central and South America, and were early signs that the era in which the revised Top Gear had been born into was starting to slowly drift away. He'd apologised for the comments in the immediate weeks following the episode's broadcast, but as many people have learned in the decades since, this doesn't really help. As the 2010s progressed, Hammond would continue to host Top Gear, a couple of other programs, help to raise his two daughters, partake in live shows, and just generally settle down on the whole as he reached his 40s. And as Top Gear had its next few specials, he began to reflect on his past a little bit more, including driving many of his 80s and 90s heroes all over the test track in columns he would write for Top Gear's Associated magazine. Towards the end of his run at Top Gear, Hammond would fulfill another of his boyhood dreams by appearing in an issue of the Beano. In 2012, Richard Hammond's Crash Course would go to air, a series in which Hammond would be tasked with learning various strenuous jobs in the United States, one of which involved him playing the role of stuntman whilst he sat inside a specially rigged Ford Crown Victoria, which was then sent hurtling through the air and rolling multiple times whilst Hammond was inside it. The series was something of a mild success, with the second season rated a lot higher than the clumsy first one, and kept him occupied during the majority of the year Top Gear was off the air owing to the Summer Olympics. At the end of the year, perhaps as a consolation for not being able to feature in that year's Top Gear home video, Richard Hammond would single-handedly produce a Top Gear special designed to commemorate 50 years of the James Bond franchise all by himself. He'd reunite many of the then surviving personalities who would help to bring Ian Fleming's spy thriller magic to our cinema screens, including Sir Roger Moore, then current Bond Daniel Craig, director Guy Hamilton, and producer Michael G. Wilson, as well as an impromptu encounter with a certain Ben Collins, who was part of Skyfall's stunt team. Though the special only featured the talents of Hammond and tried to condense 50 years of cars into an hour's worth of programming, the episode still had some rather memorable moments in its own right, certainly among Hammond's best, chiefly the invisible Ford Transit covered in LEDs, and the submersible Lotus that actually did what the car in The Spy Who Loved Me was purported to do. And though the build wasn't perfect, it was undeniably one of the coolest things ever shown on the programme, with even Hammond himself unable to contain his joy. With Top Gear now beginning to realise the tremendous legacy it was still creating at this point, as well as his schedule beginning to clear up, Richard Hammond was ready and willing to involve himself much more with Top Gear related projects. In 2013, he'd present the Top Gear Top 41 compilation series as a sequel to 2011's Top 40 series, and rather infamously also star in the Best of British DVD exclusive, a special that was supposed to air on TV in all its badly green screen glory but ultimately never did. All these specials were followed by the very similarly executed Top Fails and Ambitious But Rubbish miniseries, the former of which did air on UK TV channel Dave, which essentially served the same purpose as all these other series, to rather pointlessly chronicle highlights that many of us had already seen ad nauseum thousands of times before without so much as an alternate angle or interesting fact we didn't know before. As part of his increased focus on Top Gear, Hammond would, after a year's sabbatical, return to the Top Gear DVD series, which now also featured Jeremy Clarkson, who decided to fold his long-running home video franchise into Top Gear's own for the final 3 years of its existence. 2013 and then 2014's Perfect Road Trips were very similar animals on the surface with almost identical premises. In the sun-kissed regions of Mediterranean, Clarkson and Hammond both attempted to describe their take on a perfect road trip across Italy and France, with many thrills and spills along the way. Both of these would end in a very Python-esque manner as they were arrested before they could consummate their drives. In September 2013, as part of the Razor Sunshine Foundation, he would grant Amelia Palmer the wish of her lifetime by driving her at speeds of over 200 miles per hour in a Lamborghini Aventador, which had been sprayed pink specifically for her, with the video of the pair becoming viral and hitting 1 million views on YouTube in a matter of days, just a couple of weeks before she would sadly pass away. 2014 would prove to be a rather challenging introspective year for the Top Gear team, but perhaps more so for Richard Hammond, who along with his wife Mindy were made ambassadors for the Midlands Air Ambulance charity that January. His 2006 accident once again resurfacing in headlines due to Michael Schumacher's near-fatal brain injuries incurred while skiing off-piste, Hammond would decide to back the children's storybook Heads Up Timtron, aimed at children with brain injuries. Later that year, he'd give one of many media introspections into his 2006 accident and started to recount how much long-term damage the crash had inflicted mentally and physically, particularly after a summer in which he was knocked off his motorbike twice in 2 separate incidents, and the air ambulance pilot who airlifted him to Leeds Royal Infirmary back in 2006, Steve Cobb, had decided to retire. Despite reassuring his audience that Top Gear was neither running out of ideas nor was he running out of enthusiasm for the programme, there were definitely some doubts lingering in Hammond's mind over the future of his role on Top Gear, particularly following the backlash over Jeremy Clarkson's slope comment during the Burma special, and especially after the team were attacked in Argentina filming their subsequent Patagonia special, where Hammond echoed sentiments shared by a lot of Top Gear's fanbase at the time, namely not so much whether the show had actually crossed any lines, but whether or not the world had simply become too sensitive for a program like Top Gear to remain on the airwaves. Rumours swirled in the months leading up to March 2015 of a new Top Gear host prior to the trio's contract renewals that April, and many had their superstitions that Top Gear's 22nd series would be their last, particularly with Jeremy Clarkson's ominous final warning circling over their heads. Sadly, this would very much prove to be the case, and rather dampened what was shaping up to be the show's best series in over half a decade, with every single member of the Top Gear team firing on all cylinders to create some of the greatest TV ever produced, particularly Hammond, who during the season opening rematch of his triumph in London 8 years earlier, now transposed to the much more lawless and chaotic streets of St. Petersburg, uttered this string of unbridled magnificent profanity after being cut off by a van.
What the hell are you, you great gangly knuckled greasy-head bag?
A couple of weeks later, with the sad departure of the Land Rover Defender looming, which at the time was the oldest car still in production in the world, and Hammond's personal favourite, having contributed to its victory as the greatest car of all time 12 years earlier on Top Gear, Hammond was given the opportunity to make a heart-tugging film that saw off the Defender's retirement in an ultimate justification of its versatility. In a famed 1980s publicity spot which was embellished for the cameras, Land Rover claimed its cars could pull themselves vertically up a dam, even though in the advert this was done with off-camera assistance. However, Richard Hammond wanted to be the man to do it for real. The man that had otherwise accomplished so much in his career and had already done everything he'd more or less set out to do, wanted to cap it all off in his favourite car ever, and he wanted to do it for the millions and millions of Top Gear fans all around the world. Sadly, despite impressively pulling itself almost the entire way up the near vertical incline using much more rope than would usually be found in a winch, it just couldn't make those final few feet. In a way, it kind of mirrored Top Gear's potential as well as Hammond's own. As they put the finishing touches on the send-off special, he made the conscious decision to wear a goatee for the first time in more than a decade, one of the things which really marked the difference between Top Gear and the trio's subsequent TV show The Grand Tour. Along with lead host Jeremy Clarkson, co-host James May, producer Andy Willman, and a plethora of other important figures within Top Gear, such as one-handed sound recordist Kith McManus, Richard Hammond would announce his departure from Top Gear in the spring of 2015, outrightly refusing multi-million-pound deals that would have seen the pair present with a new co-presenter, likely one of the BBC's choosing. However, before Hammond left, he gave us, the audience, one final death-defying stunt, something that we hadn't seen from him for many years at this point, understandably so due to himself and Mindy's wishes to keep him extra safe from harm. During the classic Roadster Challenge in Series 22's final episode, Hammond would be strapped down in a chair to the roof of a stunt plane and then flown at a height of several thousand feet in the air. Though it obviously wasn't Hammond's intention at the time, this was more or less the perfect way for him to cap off his time on the show. One final hurrah that harkened back to his earliest days on Top Gear. And much like his two co-hosts, during the 18-month-long intermission between the Holy Trinity shootout at Portimao Raceway and the premiere of their new show's first episode on Amazon Prime, Richard Hammond embarked on a sort of farewell tour as he, along with Clarkson and May, had finally outgrown the backyard of British TV that they'd resided in for well over 15 years at this point. He'd helped to complete the final few live shows the trio would ever partake in, the BBC having effectively severed their ties with brand events from the minute Danny Cohen and Tony Hall thought they knew better than 350 million people, before a few gratuitous appearances on various talk shows and panel shows on both sides of the pond in the run-up to their grand return. Once under Amazon's umbrella, Hammond would be spotted in Italy, filming one of the show's upcoming episodes, and was met with overwhelming fanfare normally reserved for sports stars, royalty, or actors of a high esteem, showing just how much his popularity had grown in little over a decade. And by the time season 1 of the Grand Tour made it to air, this popularity hadn't dissipated. He would learn to drift and power slide in late 2016, proving that you could still teach an old dog new tricks, and charged into 2017 with a head full of steam, or rather electricity, and a bit too much of it. In July of that year, as part of the Past v Present v Future Challenge, which compared the past of pure petrol power, the present of hybrid supercars, and the future of all electric supercars, Hammond would opt for the latter, being handed a Rimac Concept 1. With almost all of the footage gathered for the film, Hammond would participate in the Berggrennen hill climb in Switzerland, which would prove to be a very costly mistake indeed. After putting in a very impressive performance, Hammond would overestimate where the final corner was, and didn't adequately slow down in time as he passed the finish line, causing the Rimac to lose traction, collide with a pole that was at the top of the hillside, and careen down the side of a very steep hill which had no guardrails or other protective barriers, where fault was attributed to the event organisers as opposed to Hammond, where he then flipped multiple times, breaking his legs and fracturing one of his knees in the process. Help was quickly on hand to pull Hammond away from the wreckage and cut his clothes off to check for injuries, but he was able to escape on his own steam before the battery cells ruptured and caught aflame, with the fire itself still burning many days later due to thermal runaway, a very pressing problem that doesn't exist for conventionally fueled cars. Coupled with Jeremy Clarkson's near-fatal bout of pneumonia that kept the latter bedridden very shortly after, filming for Season 2 of the Grand Tour ground to a complete halt. Once Hammond was suitably ambulatory yet again, profusely apologising to his friends and family for giving them another major scare, he was once again relegated to the use of crutches, which he'd used during the race to Niagara Falls. A short while later, Mate Rimac, the founder of Rimac, would discuss Hammond's crash with the Top Gear host, as well as dedicating a small tribute or two in Hammond's honour. On top of the usual fare he would present many times for Top Gear and the Grand Tour over the years, Hammond would produce some very nice heartfelt mini-documentaries for the latter, particularly one for racing hero Jim Clark, as well as contributing to the series' final film, sharing his memories of Ford's big saloon car before the Mondeo was scheduled to cease production a short while later. Once the Grand Tour wrapped up in the spring of 2019, Hammond would present a promotional video for the then upcoming Land Rover Defender, given it was a successor to his all-time favourite car, before continuing to present a whole variety of other videos for Drive Tribe, the still operational YouTube arm of the experimental automotive social media platform himself and other former Top Gear figures had created several years earlier, with a particularly popular series being the build process for Hammond's new car, a Morgan Plus 6. As is seemingly tradition for Hammond, he would lose this Morgan in 2021 due to flood damage. In 2022, Hammond would prove old habits died hard as he would once again buy a Dodge Charger, this time a more modern black Hellcat. Also that year, following an extensive 15-year-long restoration process after initial presumptions that it was destined to be scrapped, Richard Hammond sat back down in the car that almost killed him, the Vampire Dragster. Because even though they had each tried their hardest, it turns out that neither of them could kill the other. Man and machine had formed such an unlikely bond forged in blood and twisted metal. As well as presenting a number of other solo series such as Richard Hammond's Big, which was similar to his earlier show Engineering Connections, as well as the much less successful Great Escapists with ex-Mythbuster Tory Bellecci, as the 2020s dawned, Hammond vowed to make good on his car restoration hobby, which had realistically gone nowhere given the success of his Forenza and Land Rover projects. To do this, he was forced to sell several cars and motorcycles from his collection in order to raise the necessary capital to convert a nearby building into a suitable location from which he could restore cars. In late 2021, Richard Hammond's workshop would premiere on Discovery Plus for a trial run of 6 episodes, and generally received acclaim once viewers looked past the false drama of Hammond's money woes and focused more on his genuine enthusiasm towards giving older cars a new lease of life. After so many years of trying to create a memorable TV series outside of Top Gear, Richard Hammond had finally hit his niche. Workshop was an immediate hit for Hammond upon its launch and was consummately greenlit for a second series, which in turn was followed by a third series a year later and a fourth series a year after that, with no signs of stopping anytime soon. Together with the Greenhouse family and Isaac Marriott, Hammond has helped to bring a whole new lease of life to many stricken classic cars, as well as finding a lovely little partner for Oliver, a second Opel Kadett which was unsurprisingly named Olivia. Of the three hosts, given Clarkson's newfound love for farming and brewing and May's obsession with science and technology, Hammond is the Top Gear personality most actively involved with the car community, regularly attending various shows across the United Kingdom along with his colourful collection of classic cars. As things presently stand, what was once Top Gear's beloved resident Hamster still has a fairly bright, optimistic future ahead of him, and though he was never my favourite Top Gear presenter personally, he was definitely a very integral part of the show's success which cannot be ignored in the grander scheme of things. Even though he wasn't warmly received at first, with many contemporary detractors calling him a gimp, among other derogatory statements, Richard Hammond eventually earned the respect of Top Gear viewers worldwide following the bravery he displayed after both of his life-threatening accidents, and became a crucial and integral part of the Holy Trinity. His earlier career at Men & Motors served as a major stepping stone that helped to land him the job at Top Gear, one which he never forgot. And once on Top Gear, helped to push the show's boundaries out by taking on the persona of a daredevil in the image of his idols Eddie Kidd and Evel Knievel. To really sum up Richard Hammond's televisual career, his presence on Top Gear gave the program its final necessary kick to really resonate with the younger generation it would eventually strike a chord with. Otherwise, without Hammond, the show would have just likely devolved into the middle-aged ramblings of two older grey blokes with conflicting personalities, endlessly arguing over trivial mundanities such as what the extra button in a 1970s Saab did every single week. From his 2002 appointment, Richard Hammond helped to give the show a sense of purpose and direction that it otherwise might have lacked. The fact that his image appealed so well to the younger female fans of Top Gear helped to effortlessly break an audience glass ceiling in a way many other series would have tried their hardest to cater to and yet still embarrassingly bounced off of. And unlike certain other Top Gear hosts, though he certainly might have felt out of place or even annoying during the show's early days, echoing the sentiments of many viewers of the era, he gradually became more and more comfortable with the job of a lifetime he had been handed the reins to. He never treated Top Gear as a side hobby, and when it needed him the most, he rose to the occasion even if there was blood streaming from his helmet. To him, much like co-presenters Jeremy Clarkson and James May, whose stories will also be told, Top Gear was the dream job of a lifetime, and Richard Hammond certainly treated it like one, even when it almost killed him several times over, and helped to make Top Gear his own using the knowledge he'd applied from elsewhere. Even if his footprint was that much smaller, both figuratively and literally, than his two co-presenters and the boss they worked under, Top Gear could not have enjoyed the whirlwind of success that it did without Richard Hammond. He brought a childlike sense of wonder that the other hosts somewhat lacked, but a large part of the programme's viewer base definitely had in the show's earlier years, and ultimately proved, even if he was shunned at one point in time for other personalities, that he was the right man for the job. That through his tireless work and dedication to a job that very nearly got the better of him, Richard Hammond drove his way into the annals of British and worldwide televisual history alike, perhaps not as Top Gear's greatest ever host, but certainly in an echelon far above the grand majority of his contemporaries, which made him the perfect foil for the more blokey Clarkson and May. His tendency to personify cars such as Oliver in the Botswana special, and his ill-fated Toyota Land Cruiser which he nicknamed Donkey in the Bolivia special, further gave Hammond a more childlike personality that resonated more with Top Gear's younger viewers, amplifying the programme's reach far beyond the few million car enthusiasts it originally targeted. For many of us growing up on Top Gear, he was the closest any of us ever got to being in an episode of Top Gear ourselves. It is therefore my erstwhile conclusion that Richard Hammond's infectious enthusiasm, quick wit, and undeniable charm, particularly towards the younger audience who grew up on Top Gear, made him a truly beloved host. His daring stunts and adventurous spirit added a rather unique element to the show, while his genuine passion for cars and undeniable chemistry with the other two hosts made for some truly unforgettable television. Decades from now, Richard Hammond will always be remembered as a key part of what helped to make Top Gear so special during its 2000s to early 2010s heyday, and the impact he left on the show ensures that Top Gear fans will continue to remember his many brilliant contributions to the overall programme's mythos in rich, lengthy chapters, rather than the mere footnotes of those who came after him. Thank you, Richard Hammond, for even if you weren't everyone's cup of tea, you were still a fantastic, endearing Top Gear and Grand Tour host. And with that concludes the story of Richard Hammond. Again, I do hope you've enjoyed my documentary, as for a video that, much like the one before it was supposed to be out months before it actually released, it seems fate had other plans in store for me. Some of the reasons as to why this happened I explained on my Twitter account, including the motherboard that decided to end its entire existence rather than finish the render of a very different, much simpler version of this documentary that I'm actually thankful never saw the light of day. The final script this video uses is practically an entirely different documentary at this point, with only around 25 to 30 minutes from the original November 2022 script intact. Around 40 to 50 minutes were hastily rewritten during the last 2 to 3 months to get the documentary to the 2-hour mark without unnecessarily dawdling, but what I ended up producing I feel was far stronger than what I'd started with. Part of my motivation for taking as long as I felt was necessary to develop this video to its fullest is because I want to prove certain naysayers of mine wrong, whether you're just a typical troll or someone who might have actually written an episode or two of Top Gear, yet nonetheless talking out of the very same orifice. And in my honest opinion, a showrunner cannot ever truly know the impact his show had on a larger audience of people if he is unwilling to listen to anyone from outside his immediate bubble. Because quite simply, and this isn't a brag, even if it certainly sounds like it, I would say there are very few people that truly know and understand as much about Top Gear throughout its entire history as I do, particularly for someone who never worked on it, as I hope to have demonstrated with this documentary, along with a lot of further historical credentials to back that up. Over the past 7 years, I have single-handedly identified a good 80 to 90% of all pre-2002 Top Gear episodes through nothing more than vague Radio Times listings that I had to manually navigate to on the old BBC Genome service, a lot of which hadn't been indexed by Google at the time. including all of the BBC One Motor Show specials, as well as then having to sift through megabytes of non-publicly available BBC Infax entries generously supplied to me by Robert Williams of Des and Mick Online in late 2019 to further identify episodes which for a good 15 to 20 years prior were identified on websites such as YouTube and IMDb solely as episodes which aired during a particular year, with no attempt made to actually identify the individual episodes and air dates despite sufficient information already existing online until I came along. I then helped to compile the largest known archive of these pre-2002 Top Gear episodes on the internet, since the BBC won't ever properly make them available in any service beyond a few teasing clips cropped to 16:9, including reconstructing many episodes through clips and segments alone. I tracked down and created lossless digitizations of many DVDs previously unavailable on the internet for the viewing pleasure of millions. I spearheaded a search for the original as-broadcast versions of the first 3 series of Top Gear due to the missing footage which had been cut out from them, in addition to locating the highest known quality available of Series 6 through 13 of Top Gear, which even to this day still remain at a bitrate noticeably higher than even BBC's iPlayer, or indeed anywhere else for that matter. As I've stated in the past, and will state once again for posterity, through these videos I want to enforce just how important and influential the online Top Gear community through websites such as Pistonheads, lesser known fan efforts like the James May board, and in particular Alex Mills's Final Gear was for a program like Top Gear, coming along at precisely the right moment in history so that the internet could help to make it successful in a way that it really wasn't quite yet happening in its native United Kingdom, and helping to keep it on the airways during its more tumultuous years where its future wasn't always guaranteed. If the one man that Top Gear made world famous who didn't actually owe anything to Mills given he was already a long-established household name as far back as the dawn of the 1990s, still found the time to commiserate over his tragic demise less than 2 weeks after the event, then surely certain writers who a much larger amount of their fame, fortune and notoriety can be directly attributed to Mills's tireless efforts could have done a little bit better than inviting him round to attend a single studio session only to miss him completely, didn't really seem to care all that much that he had, and then never gave a single further thought to him until a full 2.5 years after his death, an entire decade later, where he seemed to be wholly unaware of what Final Gear even was. Given that the people who are successful today off the back of the communities who helped them to get there, such as Pistonheads and Final Gear, seem not all that interested in giving those who ran them their dues because they're a member of the unwashed masses who never worked a day in television and only caused headaches for the company they worked for's legal department, I feel it all the more important to share the story as someone who was there from very early on in the show's success, before it is potentially erased for good and revisionistic pro-corporate narratives invariably take over. Through these videos, I want to make absolutely and undeniably crystal clear the key impact and crucial role the online car community had in turning Top Gear from BBC Two's poxy little motoring show into a billion-dollar juggernaut at its absolute zenith, particularly during the days well before any international TV deals came calling and Top Gear became a social media giant. To as best tell the story of Top Gear that we knew back then using as much historically documented evidence, forum threads and other contemporary media as much as possible over retroactive continuity and anecdotal rambling. And if some individuals see fit to deny that and write their own history about Top Gear, whether figuratively or literally, then that's their choice. And in response, I will continue to venerate the names of individuals such as Alex Mills, his sister Armuri, David Edmonston, Roger Tattersall, Eamon, who the online community better knew as Jabba, Vuk of the online UK TV scene community, and any other individual, past or present, who directly or indirectly helped to contribute to Top Gear's early spread and later success, until they are recognised as just as important figures as the people who starred in and wrote it. Because Top Gear, much like the cars in James May's brief spin-off series, was a show of the people. Jeremy Clarkson, Richard Hammond and James May might have starred in it, and Andy Woolman, Richard Porter, Grant Wardrop and the Hunter brothers might have helped to write and produce it, but it was us who tuned in every single week for 13 years straight for nearly 200 Sundays, sometimes more than that if we caught the repeats and compilations, turned up to their studio in droves and purchased tickets to their many live tours, helped them to win popularity contests such as winning Channel 4's Best TV Show of the Decade, subscribed to their magazine and YouTube channel, and of course bought their books and DVDs every single Christmas. And I don't want anyone connected to the Top Gear fandom to ever forget that. Top Gear was as much our show as it was the show of those who actually made it, and this is a story I'd like to continue telling until there is nothing left to tell. But before I go, I cannot keep making these videos without your continued support. If you've been following me wherever possible, you would know I've had a very troublesome past few weeks for a video that was honestly supposed to be out a lot earlier in the year, and I firmly applaud everyone's patience to those who have waited out, whose selfless contributions keep me sustained between videos of which I really do plan to increase my output after a quite frankly paltry 2023. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I hope to see you all in the next video, whenever that may be. Farewell.